Hello there, and welcome to History for Lunatics. I'm glad you're here tonight. Settle in wherever you are, whether you're listening from a bedroom with the lights turned low, a kitchen after everyone else has gone quiet, a parked car before going inside, or some corner of the world where the hour is already later than you meant it to be. Tonight we're not going into a palace, or a battlefield painted afterward to look cleaner than it was, or a room where generals lean over maps while someone in the background quietly brings them coffee. We're going to a place in American history that is much harder to see, because it does not look like a single decision. It looks like a habit forming slowly. It looks like a country discovering that it can go to war without fully saying the word war. It looks like a government learning that fear can become policy, that emergency can become routine, and that soldiers can be sent across an ocean before most citizens have even understood what question they are supposed to be answering. The topic tonight is the Korean War, but not only the Korean War as it is usually described. Not just June 25th, 1950, when North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel and drove south towards Seoul. Not just the frozen roads, the retreat from the Chosun Reservoir, the Chinese intervention, the stalemate, the prisoner exchanges, or the armistice signed on July 27, 1953. Those things matter, and we will spend time with them. But the deeper question tonight is what Korea did to the United States itself. How did a war that so many Americans barely remembered even while it was happening teach America to remain permanently ready for the next one? How did a conflict that was never formally declared help create a pattern that would echo through Vietnam, the Gulf War, Iraq, Afghanistan, and the long age of military action that followed? The Korean War began when North Korean forces invaded South Korea on June 25, 1950. The United Nations Security Council condemned the attack and called for assistance to South Korea, and President Harry Truman committed American forces under that United Nations framework rather than through a formal congressional declaration of war. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something simple. When you hear the phrase "forgotten war," what do you think it means? Does it mean people did not care? Does it mean they were distracted? Does it mean the war was too confusing to become a clean national story? Or does it mean something more uncomfortable, that forgetting was useful because remembering it clearly would force people to ask what had changed? The Korean War sits in American memory like a chair pushed halfway under a table. It is there, but it does not draw the eye. World War II is remembered with parades and photographs and moral certainty. Vietnam is remembered with argument, protest, music, trauma, and a long national reckoning that never quite ended. Korea sits between them, quieter, colder, and in some ways more important than either for understanding what came next. It was the war that taught Washington a new way of operating. Not total war like World War II, with the whole society mobilized and every household knowing exactly what was at stake. Not peace, either. Something in between. A limited war. A police action. A test of containment. A military emergency managed by experts. A place where American troops fought, died, advanced, retreated and dug in, while the country at home was asked to support the struggle without fully entering the old emotional state of war. That in-between condition is where the modern American war habit began to take shape. Now, if this kind of storytelling speaks to you, if you like history told slowly enough that the details have room to breathe, it would mean a great deal if you subscribed and gave this video a like. You do not have to do it right this second. Do it when something catches you. Do it when a date suddenly feels less like a date and more like a door opening. And if you feel like sharing where you are listening from tonight, or what time it is where you are, put it in the comments. I always find that interesting, because history feels different depending on the hour. A war story heard at noon feels like information. A war story heard at night feels a little closer to confession. So let us begin carefully, because this is one of those stories where the first mistake is thinking the war started when the shooting started. In 1945, Korea was not supposed to become the place where the United States learned to live with permanent war. It was a country emerging from decades of Japanese colonial rule, exhausted by occupation, divided not by some ancient natural border, but by a line chosen quickly near the end of World War II. The 38th parallel, that clean classroom phrase, sounds almost official enough to seem inevitable. It was not inevitable. It was a line across a peninsula, a military convenience that hardened into a political border and then into a front line. North of it, Soviet influence helped shape a communist state under Kim Il-sung. South of it, American influence supported the Republic of Korea under Syngman Rhee. Both governments claimed legitimacy over all Korea. Both saw division as temporary. Both were authoritarian in different ways. Both were backed by larger powers that insisted, at least in public, that they wanted peace while preparing for the possibility that peace would fail. The Korean peninsula had become a place where local ambitions and global anxieties overlapped. That is one of the first important things to understand. Korea was not simply a chess square in the Cold War, though American officials often treated it that way. It was home to millions of people who had already endured empire, liberation, division, political violence and civil conflict before the outside world decided their suffering had become strategically important. For the United States, the timing was brutal. 5 years after World War II, Americans wanted normal life. They wanted houses, wages, children, appliances, college through the GI Bill, and a future that did not smell like uniforms and ration books. The country had defeated Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, demobilized millions of troops, and tried to tell itself that the terrible emergency of the 1940s was over. But the world after 1945 did not become quiet. The Soviet Union tightened control over Eastern Europe. China became communist in 1949. The Soviet Union tested an atomic bomb that same year. American policymakers began to speak about communism not as a set of separate movements in separate countries, but as one expanding force that had to be contained everywhere. This is where Korea becomes more than Korea. The invasion of South Korea seemed to confirm the darkest warnings already circulating inside Washington. Earlier in 1950, the National Security Council had produced NSC 68, a major Cold War strategy document arguing that the United States needed a much larger military and a more forceful containment policy against Soviet power. The Korean War made that argument feel less like a proposal and more like proof. Defence spending rose sharply in response to the war and the broader requirements of NSC 68. This is the part where the story becomes unsettling, because the Korean War did not simply interrupt American peace, it changed what peace meant. Before Korea, many Americans still imagined war and peace as two distinct conditions. War was the emergency, peace was the return. Korea blurred that line. The United States did not declare war. Congress did not issue the old formal statement that would have placed the nation in a clear constitutional condition. Truman called the intervention a police action, under the authority of the United Nations, a phrase that sounded smaller than war and cleaner than invasion. It sounded temporary. It sounded controlled. It sounded like something a responsible country did to restore order. But for the men landing at Busan, for the civilians fleeing Seoul, for the pilots flying missions, for the families receiving telegrams, the language did not soften the facts. American soldiers were fighting a war whether Washington used the old word or not. That difference between what a government calls a thing and what the thing actually is becomes one of the great American themes after Korea. Once leaders learned that they could commit forces under the language of emergency, collective security, credibility, and containment, the old threshold of declared war began to lose some of its power. I want you to sit with the phrase police action for a moment, not because it is funny, but because it is revealing. A police action suggests that the world already has a law, and that someone merely needs to enforce it. It turns soldiers into officers of order. It turns a battlefield into a disturbance. It reduces the political weight of what is being done. That was part of its usefulness. The Korean War arrived at a moment when the United Nations was still new enough to carry enormous hope. World War II had ended with promises that collective security might prevent another catastrophe. When the Security Council condemned North Korea's invasion and called for assistance, the United States could frame its military action as defense of an international system rather than as an American war of choice. There was truth in that. North Korea had crossed the line. South Korea had been attacked. The United Nations did act. But there was also a new habit being born inside the truth. If war could be described as enforcement, if military action could be treated as maintenance of order, if the president could act quickly and then explain afterward, the distance between peace and war had narrowed in a way most Americans did not yet grasp. The deeper addiction was not to battle itself. Most ordinary Americans did not want more battle. Soldiers did not want more battle. Families did not want more telegrams. When we say that Korea helped make America addicted to war, we are not talking about a simple love of violence. We are talking about a dependence on war as a tool of policy, war as proof of seriousness, war as the thing presidents reach for when credibility feels threatened, war as the engine that justifies budgets, alliances, bases, weapons programs, intelligence structures, and a permanent national security state. Addiction is a strong word, and it should be used carefully. What Korea created was a pattern of reliance. Before Korea, the United States could still imagine itself as a country that raised armies for emergencies and then sent them home. After Korea, that older rhythm became harder to recover. The United States began to accept that readiness itself had to be permanent. Bases had to remain. Forces had to be stationed overseas. Defense industries had to keep producing. Intelligence had to keep watching. Presidents had to keep demonstrating resolve. The emergency did not end. It moved. Think about what that meant in daily political life. A budget was no longer just a budget. It was a signal to Moscow. A small country's civil conflict was no longer only a local tragedy. It was a test of American will. A retreat was no longer only a military adjustment. It was a message to allies and enemies. A president was not only managing events, he was managing credibility. That strange word that would haunt American foreign policy for decades. Credibility sounds responsible. It sounds adult. But credibility can become a trap. Because once a country defines its power by the fear that others will stop believing in it, almost any distant crisis can begin to feel personal. Korea taught American leaders that a war could be fought not only for territory, not only for direct defense, but for the meaning of American promises. South Korea mattered in itself, but it also became a symbol of whether the United States would resist communist expansion anywhere. Once that logic took hold, maps changed their emotional meaning. Places most Americans could not find easily became tests of national character. Hills, rivers, villages, ports and capitals became evidence in an argument about resolve. There is a small human detail inside all of this that gets lost when we talk only about doctrine. In June 1950, many of the American troops first sent into Korea were not prepared for the kind of war they entered. The United States had demobilized after World War II. Occupation troops in Japan were often undertrained for immediate combat. Equipment was worn. Units were not at full strength. The first American ground troops thrown into the fighting, including Task Force Smith, were sent in partly because someone had to go quickly, and partly because officials believed American presence itself might stiffen resistance and slow the North Korean advance. That idea, that the appearance of American force could shape events even before overwhelming strength arrived, would become familiar later. But in Korea, the lesson was paid for in panic, retreat, and bodies. It is one thing to say that a country is containing communism. It is another thing to be a young soldier on a road in Korea, sweating in summer heat, watching enemy armour approach with weapons that may not stop it. Policy becomes very physical at that point. It becomes weight in your pack, mud on your boots, fear in your throat, and the knowledge that someone far away has decided the line must be held. At home, the war never produced the complete social mobilization of World War II. There were no great unified rituals of national sacrifice on the same scale. There was censorship, frustration, confusion, anger, and eventually exhaustion. Americans followed the news, but many did not know what victory was supposed to look like once the war changed shape. At first, the goal seemed simple: repel the invasion and save South Korea. Then, after the daring landing at Incheon and the collapse of North Korean forces, the goal expanded toward reunifying Korea under the South. United Nations forces crossed the 38th parallel. They moved toward the Yalu River near China. Then Chinese forces entered the war in massive numbers, and suddenly the conflict widened in danger, even as officials still tried to keep it limited in name. That is another Korean lesson that would return again and again. Limited war sounds manageable in Washington, but limits are not controlled by one side alone. The enemy gets a vote, geography gets a vote, weather gets a vote, domestic politics gets a vote, pride gets a vote. Once a war begins, it develops its own appetite. The Korean War also forced Americans to accept a strange new kind of ending. World War II had ended with surrender ceremonies, occupied capitals, and unmistakable defeat of the enemy. Korea ended with an armistice, not a peace treaty, after years of negotiation and killing along lines that ended up close to where the conflict had begun. The armistice signed on July 27, 1953, stopped organised combat and left the peninsula divided near the 38th parallel with no final peace settlement. That mattered. A war could now end without victory in the old sense. It could stop. It could freeze. It could remain unresolved. Americans would have to learn the language of stalemate, ceasefire, demilitarized zone, limited objective, acceptable cost, and negotiated settlement. In one sense, that was realistic. Nuclear weapons had changed the stakes. Total victory against every communist power was not possible without risking catastrophe. But psychologically it left something unfinished. The war did not give Americans the satisfaction of a clear triumph or the moral shock of an obvious defeat. It gave them something murkier. It gave them continuation. And continuation is the key to this whole story. The Korean War continued after the guns quieted because the structures built for it did not disappear. The larger defence budget did not simply shrink back to the old pre-war world. The alliance system in Asia became more permanent. The American military presence overseas became easier to justify. The national security state gained arguments it could use again. If Korea could happen, then readiness had to be constant. If a local invasion could be part of a global communist strategy, then local conflicts could no longer be treated as local. If delay could mean disaster, then presidents needed flexibility. If Congress moved too slowly, the executive branch had to move first. These were not all irrational lessons. Some were grounded in real danger. North Korea did invade. China did intervene. The Soviet Union was a serious rival. The early Cold War was not imaginary, but real danger can still produce dangerous habits. A person who once survived a house fire may check the stove carefully for the rest of his life. That is understandable. But if he begins to smell smoke in every room, every day, even when there is no fire, then survival has changed him in another way. There is something important here that I do not want to simplify. The United States did not become addicted to war because one president woke up eager for endless conflict. It happened through institutions, incentives, fears, and precedents. Truman believed he was defending South Korea and the credibility of the United Nations. Military planners believed weakness invited aggression. Defense contractors responded to government demand. Members of Congress denounced softness and worried about communism. Allies wanted reassurance. Voters wanted safety. Newspapers demanded action and then criticised the cost. Generals wanted room to win. Presidents wanted tools that did not require slow constitutional drama every time a crisis broke open. Each piece had its own logic. Put together, those pieces formed a machine that was very hard to turn off. That is how historical habits usually form, not with a villain laughing in a dark office, but with serious people solving immediate problems in ways that create larger problems later. So tonight, as we begin, I want you to picture America in the summer of 1950, not as a giant striding confidently into another war, but as a tired country startled awake. The Second World War was only 5 years gone. Veterans were still young, families were still rebuilding, the atomic age had just begun. The Cold War was becoming colder by the month. Then the news came from Korea, and suddenly a peninsula many Americans had barely thought about became the place where the future seemed to be testing them. The decision to intervene happened quickly. The words used to describe it were careful. The consequences lasted for generations. A country that had once imagined war as a temporary storm began building a house designed for permanent bad weather. More soldiers, more bases, more aircraft, more planning rooms, more maps, more classified papers, more reasons why the next emergency could not be ignored. And this is where we need to step closer. Because before we can understand how Korea changed the American mind, we have to understand the first act of transformation, how the United States went to war without saying, in the old formal way, that it was at war. The Constitution had one expectation, the Cold War had another, and in the space between them, President Truman found a path that later presidents would study, whether they admitted it or not. The Korean War was not declared by Congress. It was carried forward through presidential authority, United Nations resolutions, emergency logic, and the argument that speed mattered more than ceremony. That decision did not feel like a revolution at the time. It felt like a response to crisis. But many of the most important changes in history arrive that way, not as announcements, but as exceptions that become examples. The strange thing about the Korean War is that one of its most important facts is not about a battle at all. It is not about a hill taken and lost again, not about a frozen road crowded with exhausted Marines, not about a general standing before microphones, not about a ruined city changing hands for the second or third time. It is about a sentence that was never spoken in the old formal way. The United States never declared war. American troops fought. American planes bombed. American ships shelled the coast. American families received news that their sons had been killed or wounded or captured. American taxpayers paid for the enormous machinery that made the fighting possible. But Congress did not issue a declaration of war against North Korea or China or anyone else. The old constitutional ritual, the solemn act that had marked the War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, the Spanish-American War, World War I and World War II did not happen. Instead, the country slipped into war through a side door, under the language of the United Nations, executive authority, emergency response, and collective security. And once that side door had been opened, presidents after Truman would notice that it did not easily close. To understand why this mattered so much, you have to imagine the United States government not as we know it now, accustomed to military operations in distant countries, with names that appear suddenly on television screens, but as a republic still carrying an older memory of what war was supposed to look like. The Constitution gave Congress the power to declare war for a reason. The framers did not trust one person with the ability to plunge the country into large-scale conflict whenever fear, ambition, anger, or pride demanded it. They had studied kings. They knew what happened when rulers treated war as a personal instrument. They had watched empires bleed ordinary people for dynastic arguments and territorial appetites, so they divided the power. The president would command the armed forces once they were in the field, but Congress would decide whether the country entered a state of war. It was not a perfect system, and it had always contained tension, but the basic idea was clear enough. War was too dangerous, too expensive, too morally heavy to be placed entirely in the hands of one man. By June 1950, that older idea was already under strain. The United States had grown into a world power. It had troops overseas, it had atomic weapons, it had global alliances forming, It had intelligence agencies and military planners and diplomats reading cables from every corner of the world. The pace of events had changed. A crisis could unfold in hours while Congress debated in days. That was the practical argument, and it was not imaginary. When North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel on June 25th, they did not do it politely, waiting for American constitutional procedures to arrange themselves. They moved quickly. Seoul was in danger almost immediately. The South Korean army was badly shaken. The Truman administration believed that if the United States hesitated, South Korea might collapse before any formal political decision could catch up. This is how emergencies always introduce themselves. They do not arrive saying, "Please abandon your old safeguards." They arrive saying, "There is no time." And sometimes they are right. That is what makes them so powerful. President Harry Truman was at home in Independence, Missouri when the news came. He was not a man naturally given to the sweeping theatrical style of some presidents. He could be blunt, stubborn, plain-spoken, sometimes insecure, sometimes decisive in ways that surprised even those around him. He had inherited the presidency after Franklin Roosevelt's death, inherited the end of World War II, inherited the atomic bomb, inherited the beginning of the Cold War, inherited a world that seemed determined to test him from every direction. When Korea erupted, Truman and his advisors saw more than a regional invasion. They saw the possibility of a global pattern. To them, North Korea's attack was not simply Kim Il-sung trying to reunify the peninsula by force. It looked like communist aggression backed, or at least permitted, by Moscow, and perhaps connected to the wider momentum of communism after the fall of China the year before. Whether that interpretation was complete or not, it shaped everything. Truman believed that if the United States failed to respond, the lesson to the Soviet Union would be obvious. Push somewhere, test the line, see if America steps back. The memory of the 1930s hung heavily over these men. They believed appeasement had encouraged Hitler. They did not want Korea to become the new Manchuria, the new Rhineland, the new small place everyone regretted ignoring after it was too late. There is a small but revealing detail in the way the administration moved. Truman did not go first to Congress asking for a declaration of war. He went through the United Nations. The Soviet Union, by a twist of timing that now seems almost unbelievable, was boycotting the Security Council because the United Nations still recognized Chiang Kai-shek's government in Taiwan rather than Mao's government in Beijing as the representative of China. Because the Soviet delegate was absent, he could not veto the Security Council resolutions condemning the North Korean invasion and recommending that members assist South Korea. That absence mattered enormously. It gave Truman an international legal and moral framework. The United States could say it was not acting alone. It was upholding the United Nations Charter. It was defending a member state from aggression. It was enforcing collective security, the very idea that had supposedly failed with the League of Nations before World War II. To many Americans, this sounded noble and practical. To Truman, it also solved a political problem. He could move fast. He could present the action as part of America's obligations to the New World Order. He could avoid the old domestic fight that a formal war declaration might create. But here is where the language begins to matter. When reporters asked Truman whether the country was at war, he resisted the word. The administration called it a police action. That phrase has become famous partly because it sounds almost absurd when placed beside the reality of what followed. More than 30,000 Americans would die in the Korean War. Hundreds of thousands of Koreans, Chinese and others would be killed. Cities would be devastated. Families would be divided for generations. There would be bombing campaigns, retreats, offensives, prisoner camps, bayonet fighting, frostbite, napalm, mass civilian suffering, and 3 years of grinding destruction. Yet the phrase police action remained attached to it, not because it described the experience of the people living through it, but because it described the legal and political posture of the government that had entered it. A police action was not supposed to be a war of conquest. It was supposed to restore order. It was supposed to be limited. It was supposed to suggest that the world already knew who the criminal was and who the officer was. It made the operation sound smaller, cleaner, more temporary, and more controlled than it really was. I want you to think about what that did to the American imagination. Words do not only describe policy, they make policy easier to swallow. If Truman had said, "I'm sending American boys to fight a war in Korea, but I'm not asking Congress to declare one," the contradiction would have been too visible. If he had said, "This is not war, though it will kill like war and cost like war and expand like war," people might have stopped and stared at the sentence. But police action softened the edge. It implied duty rather than choice. It suggested that America was not entering a new era of undeclared wars, but simply responding to a violation of international order. The phrase acted like a blanket thrown over a machine so people would hear less of its noise. Underneath, the gears were turning. Congress did not stop him. That is one of the most important parts of the story. There were objections, yes. There were constitutional concerns, yes. Senator Robert Taft, among others, argued that Truman had no authority to commit troops to a major war without congressional approval. Taft was no minor figure. He represented a strand of Republican skepticism toward open-ended international commitments, a belief that the president's action had crossed a constitutional line. But the larger political climate worked against resistance. Who wanted to be seen, in the summer of 1950, as slow to resist communism? Who wanted to look as though they were tying the president's hands while Seoul fell and soldiers fought? Congress had the power to object more forcefully, to cut funds, to demand a declaration, to force a confrontation over authority. Instead, most members accepted the situation, criticised aspects of the policy, funded the effort, and let the precedent settle into place. That is often how power shifts in government. Not through one dramatic seizure, but through one branch acting and the other branch deciding, for reasons of fear, convenience, agreement, or political caution, not to pull the power back. The public, too, was placed in a strange position. Americans were told that this was a United Nations action, but the United States supplied the overwhelming share of the force. They were told it was limited, but the casualty lists grew. They were told it was necessary, but the goals changed. In the first weeks, the purpose was to save South Korea from conquest. After Incheon, when General Douglas MacArthur's landing turned the tide and North Korean forces began collapsing, the purpose expanded toward rolling back communism and unifying Korea. American and United Nations forces crossed the 38th parallel and moved north. For a moment, it looked as if the war might end not merely with South Korea restored, but with North Korea eliminated. Then China entered, and the war transformed again. Suddenly, American troops were not only fighting North Koreans, they were fighting Chinese forces in brutal conditions, and the possibility of a much wider war flickered into view. At every stage, the absence of a formal declaration mattered less to the battlefield than to the political system at home. The war had escaped the clean box its language had tried to build. Douglas MacArthur made that escape impossible to ignore. MacArthur was not merely a general, he was a public figure with his own mythology. To many Americans, he was the dramatic commander of the Pacific, the man who returned to the Philippines, the administrator of occupied Japan, a soldier who seemed to speak in grand historical phrases even when ordinary sentences would do. In Korea, his early brilliance at Incheon made him look almost prophetic. But his ambitions soon collided with Truman's limits. MacArthur wanted a broader war against China. He suggested bombing Chinese bases and possibly using nationalist Chinese forces from Taiwan. The Truman administration feared that widening the war could draw in the Soviet Union and risk a third world war, perhaps a nuclear one. This was the central contradiction of a limited war. You ask soldiers to fight, but not too much. You ask generals to win, but only within boundaries. You tell the public the cause is vital, but not so vital that every weapon and every target is allowed. MacArthur found that intolerable. or at least unacceptable to his sense of command. Truman found MacArthur's public defiance intolerable to civilian control. In April 1951, Truman fired him. The firing of MacArthur revealed how confused the country had become about what kind of war it was fighting. If this was merely a police action, why had one of America's most famous generals become the centre of a national crisis? If Korea was a limited operation, why did so many people believe victory required expansion? If the president could send troops without declaring war, could he also restrict the general from seeking victory as the general understood it? MacArthur returned to the United States and addressed Congress in one of the most dramatic political spectacles of the age. He spoke of old soldiers fading away, and many Americans wept, applauded, or raged. Truman's popularity suffered, yet Truman's decision also reinforced an essential principle. The military remained subordinate to civilian authority. That principle held, but something else had shifted beneath it. Civilian authority now included the ability of the president to initiate large-scale military action without the old declaration. The president could both start the warlike action and define its limits. That was an enormous concentration of practical power, even if Congress still held theoretical tools. There is a temptation to think of constitutional change only in terms of amendments, court cases, and written rules. But some of the most important constitutional changes happen through repetition. One president does something under pressure. Congress complains but funds it. The courts avoid interfering. The public adapts. Then later, another president points to the earlier example. The exception becomes a precedent. The precedent becomes a practice. The practice becomes normal. Korea did not create presidential war-making out of nothing. Earlier presidents had used military force without formal declarations in smaller conflicts and interventions. But Korea was different in scale, cost, and consequence. It was not a quick, punitive expedition. It was a major war involving hundreds of thousands of American troops over 3 years. It was fought against large communist armies under the shadow of nuclear escalation. If a president could do that without a declaration, then the practical meaning of the Declare War Clause had changed, even if the words on the page remained the same. This is where you can begin to see the line running forward. Vietnam did not begin with a declaration of war. It grew through advisory missions, presidential commitments, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, and the same kind of credibility language that Korea had helped normalize. Later conflicts would use other frameworks: congressional authorizations, United Nations resolutions, NATO commitments, claims of self-defense, counter-terrorism authority, humanitarian intervention. Each had its own circumstances. None was identical to Korea. History never repeats as neatly as people say it does. But Korea made one lesson available to future presidents. Speed, framing, and momentum can matter more than formal declarations. Once troops are committed, the debate changes. Before the troops go, the question is whether to fight. After the troops go, the question becomes whether to support them, whether to embarrass the country, whether to abandon allies, whether to invite defeat. The political ground shifts under everyone's feet. I want to pause here because this is one of those subjects where it is easy to talk only about institutions and forget the human cost of blurred language. Imagine being the parent of a soldier in 1951. Your son is in Korea. He is cold, afraid, perhaps wounded, perhaps writing letters that arrive weeks late with parts of his experience left out, because he does not want to worry you. You read in the newspaper that this is not technically a declared war. What comfort does that give you? None. The distinction matters in law and politics, but grief does not respect legal categories. A telegram does not arrive more gently, because Congress did not vote the old words. A prisoner of war does not suffer less because the conflict is described as a United Nations police action. This is the quiet cruelty of euphemism. It can help leaders manage public opinion, but it cannot protect the people who pay the price of the thing being renamed. For Korean civilians, the language was even more distant from reality. The war ripped through towns and families with a force that no phrase from Washington or New York could soften. Seoul changed hands multiple times. Refugees crowded roads. Bombing destroyed infrastructure. Political violence occurred on both sides. Villages were caught between armies, ideologies, and suspicion. The war was civil, international, ideological, and local all at once. To call it undeclared from the American perspective is accurate, but for Koreans the war did not need a declaration to be total in daily life. Their homes were the battlefield, their relatives were the missing, their fields were the routes of retreat, their cities were the objectives on the map. One reason the Korean War is so hard to remember clearly in America is that Americans often remember it as a limited war, while for Korea it was a national catastrophe. That mismatch became part of the habit too. The United States could experience a war as limited because the homeland remained untouched, while the country where the war occurred experienced it as devastation. This pattern would return in other places. The absence of a declaration also changed how responsibility felt. A declared war creates a moment that can be pointed to. Names can be counted. Votes can be listed. The country can say, on this date, after this debate, we chose war. Korea's entry was more diffuse. Truman acted. The United Nations authorized. Congress funded. The public largely accepted. Critics objected. The military obeyed. Responsibility spread out until no single act seemed to carry all the weight. That diffusion is politically useful. It makes accountability harder. It allows each actor to say that circumstances forced the decision, that allies expected it, that the enemy created the crisis, that the institution merely performed its role. Sometimes all of that is partly true. But the result is a war that feels almost weather-like, as if it happened to the government rather than being chosen by it. The more a democracy allows war to become weather, the less democratic war becomes. There was also a psychological comfort in not declaring war. A declaration would have admitted that the country had entered another major conflict only 5 years after the last one. It would have forced Americans to confront the possibility that the peace they thought they had earned in 1945 had already vanished. Calling Korea a police action allowed the public to preserve, for a while, the illusion that normal life and war could coexist without touching each other too deeply. Factories could produce, families could move to suburbs, children could be born into the baby boom, television could enter homes, the economy could grow, and somewhere far away, soldiers could fight under a name that did not demand the same total national transformation as World War II. This was not hypocrisy exactly, it was compartmentalization. The American home front learned to live beside war without becoming entirely consumed by it. That too became a modern pattern. War would be distant, professionalized, managed, televised, argued over, but not necessarily shared by the whole society in equal measure. This is one reason Korea mattered so much to what came after. It helped create a form of war that did not require every citizen to feel mobilized. The draft still existed, and many families were directly affected, but the country did not reorganize itself around Korea the way it had around World War II. Instead, it began building permanent capacity, permanent bases, permanent defense spending, permanent planning, permanent readiness. A war could be limited in public emotion, while enormous in institutional consequence. That combination is very powerful. It allows a country to fight without fully interrupting itself. It allows citizens to look away for long stretches. It allows leaders to continue military commitments without asking the public to enter the old state of shared sacrifice. The Korean War showed that this was possible, not easy, not painless, but possible. And yet, at the time, many officials believed they were preserving peace by acting this way. That is important. Truman did not think he was creating an addiction to war. He thought he was preventing a larger war by stopping aggression early. His supporters argued that the United Nations would be meaningless if North Korea's invasion went unanswered. They believed that after the failures of the 1930s, Collective security had to be real, or it would collapse. They believed that a firm response in Korea might prevent future aggression elsewhere. These arguments should not be dismissed too casually. The world of 1950 was dangerous. The invasion was real. The fear of wider communist expansion was not invented from nothing. But history often turns on the difference between solving one crisis and building the habits that define the next 50 years. Korea may have prevented one kind of collapse while encouraging another kind of permanence. It defended South Korea, which survived and eventually became a prosperous democracy after decades of authoritarian rule and struggle. It also taught the American state that warlike action could be launched under emergency authority and sustained without the old constitutional clarity. Both things can be true at the same time. History is uncomfortable that way. As the fighting dragged on, the legal ambiguity became less of a daily issue than the military stalemate. People cared about casualties, negotiations, MacArthur, China, prisoners, and whether the war would ever end. But underneath the surface, the precedent remained. The United States had crossed a threshold. The old declaration model had not disappeared, but it had been bypassed in the most significant American war since 1945. Later generations would argue over the war powers resolution, presidential authority, congressional abdication, and the proper balance between speed and consent. Those arguments did not begin in Korea, but Korea gave them a new shape. It showed that in the Cold War, presidents would claim the need to move quickly in the name of global stability. It showed that Congress might resist rhetorically while cooperating materially. It showed that the public could be carried into war through a language of limited obligation rather than national crusade. And it showed that once a conflict was framed as a test of credibility, leaving became almost as difficult as entering. By the time Dwight Eisenhower took office in 1953, the country wanted the Korean War ended, but it did not want the Cold War ended on terms that looked weak. Eisenhower understood military power deeply. He had commanded Allied forces in Europe during World War II. He knew both the necessity of force and the danger of letting military systems dominate national life. He would later warn about the military-industrial complex, a phrase that has become so familiar people sometimes forget how serious it was coming from him. But even Eisenhower could not simply return America to the pre-Korea world. The armistice stopped the fighting, but the national security posture remained. The United States did not demobilize back into innocence. It maintained commitments. It watched borders. It funded weapons. It signed treaties. It prepared for crises. It accepted that peace now required a war footing, held in reserve at all times. This is the real meaning of the war that was never declared. It was not merely a technicality. It was a change in the way America crossed the line between peace and war. Before Korea, that line had already been complicated. After Korea, it became easier to blur. The president could act first. Congress could approve later by funding. International organizations could provide legitimacy. The language of emergency could quiet constitutional discomfort. The public could be told that the action was necessary, limited, defensive, reluctant. Sometimes it was, sometimes it was not. But the mechanism was there now, tested in one of the hardest conflicts of the 20th century. A machine does not have to be used constantly to change the room it sits in. Its presence changes what people think is possible. So when we talk about America becoming addicted to war, this is one of the first habits to notice. The habit of entering conflict without the full ceremony of national decision. Not because ceremony itself is magic, but because ceremony forces a pause. It slows the hand. It requires language plain enough for the public to hear. It asks representatives to attach their names to the choice. Korea replaced that pause with urgency. The urgency may have been understandable. It may even have been necessary in the first days. But once urgency becomes a governing style, it is very hard to return to patience. A republic built to deliberate found itself operating in a world that rewarded speed, secrecy, and executive control. The Korean War did not settle that tension. It made the tension normal, And from there, the story widens. Because once the United States accepted that it could fight without declaring war, the next question became why it had to be ready to fight almost anywhere. Korea did not just change presidential power, it changed the map inside American strategy. It turned containment from an idea into a military obligation, from a sentence in policy papers into soldiers on ridgelines and bombers over valleys. It taught officials to see local conflicts as pieces of a single global struggle, and that habit would reach far beyond the Korean peninsula. Containment did not begin in Korea. That is the first thing to understand, because if we start the story in June's 1950, we miss the machinery already being assembled in the background. The word had been moving through Washington for years by then, gathering weight each time the Soviet Union tightened its grip on Eastern Europe. Each time a communist party gained strength somewhere. Each time an American official looked at a map and felt that the world was becoming less like a collection of separate countries and more like a single board on which every square mattered. The basic idea was simple enough in language and very difficult in practice. The United States would not try to roll Soviet power back by direct war, at least not openly. It would contain it. It would hold the line where communism already existed and prevent it from expanding further. That sounded measured. It sounded disciplined. It sounded like the opposite of reckless conquest. But Korea changed the meaning of containment in a way that would shape the rest of the 20th century. Before Korea, containment could still be imagined as a broad strategy made of money, diplomacy, alliances, propaganda, economic recovery and political pressure. After Korea, containment increasingly meant troops, bases, aircraft carriers, bombers, military aid, permanent readiness, and the willingness to fight in places most Americans had barely thought about the week before. The idea had come most famously from George Kennan, the American diplomat in Moscow who sent the long telegram in 1946, and then wrote, under the name X, about the need to contain Soviet expansion. Kennan's thinking was more subtle than what later politicians made of it. He did not imagine every communist movement everywhere as a direct extension of Moscow's hand. He believed Soviet power was cautious, ideological, insecure and sensitive to resistance. He thought the United States needed patience, firmness and political confidence. But once ideas enter government, they do not always remain in the form their authors intended. They are simplified. They are repeated in speeches. They are bent toward budgets. They are used by people who need answers faster than the world provides them. By the late 1940s, containment had become less a careful diagnosis and more a public test of seriousness. Are you willing to contain communism? Are you willing to hold the line? Are you willing to prove that America remembers the lessons of Munich and appeasement and will not let aggression go unanswered? That is how a strategy becomes a moral posture. And once a moral posture is attached to national pride, it becomes very hard to adjust without looking weak. There were already major signs of this before Korea. In 1947, the Truman Doctrine promised support for countries resisting subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressure, beginning with aid to Greece and Turkey. The language was sweeping, larger than the specific crisis that produced it. It suggested that the United States had taken on a global responsibility, not just to defend itself, not just to protect the Western Hemisphere, but to support resistance to communism wherever the threat appeared serious. Then came the Marshall Plan, a massive program of economic recovery for Western Europe. This was containment in one of its most successful forms. It used food, fuel, credit, industry, confidence, and rebuilding. It understood that hungry, broken societies were vulnerable to radical politics, and that prosperity could be a defence. There was NATO in 1949, a military alliance, yes, but still centred mainly on Europe. There was the Berlin airlift, where American and British aircraft supplied West Berlin after the Soviets blockaded it. All of these events built the architecture of the Cold War, but even then there was still a sense that the main theatre was Europe. that the central danger was the Soviet army on the plains of Germany, that containment had a front line everyone could picture. Then Asia unsettled everything. China became communist in 1949 after years of civil war, and the shock in American politics was enormous. People asked who lost China, as if China had ever belonged to Washington in the first place. That question was poisonous because it turned a complicated Chinese revolution into an American failure of nerve. It suggested that somewhere, someone in the State Department, or the White House, or the foreign policy establishment had been too soft, too trusting, too blind, or even disloyal. The Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb that same year, ending the brief American monopoly on nuclear weapons. Suddenly, the world felt more dangerous from two directions at once. Communism seemed to be spreading in Asia, and the nuclear balance had changed. Then, in early 1950, the National Security Council produced NSC 68, a document that argued the Soviet threat was global, ideological, and urgent, and that the United States needed a much larger military build-up to meet it. It was a hard, alarming document. It spoke in the language of survival. It treated the Cold War not as a passing diplomatic rivalry, but as a long struggle requiring mobilization of American power on a scale that peacetime Americans had not expected to sustain. At first, NCC 68 was still an argument, a serious argument, but an argument. It required money, and money required political support. The United States had demobilized after World War II. Many Americans did not want a permanent military establishment of the kind that earlier generations had associated with European empires. The country had always been suspicious, at least in theory, of standing armies. A large defence budget in peacetime needed a justification strong enough to overcome that old suspicion. Korea provided it. When North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel, the abstract warnings of NSC 68 suddenly looked like prophecy. The document had said the communist world was probing for weakness. Now there was an invasion. It had said military strength was necessary to deter aggression. Now military weakness seemed to have invited disaster. It had said the United States had to treat the struggle as global. Now a war in Korea appeared to prove that Europe was not the only front. The shooting gave the theory blood, and once a theory has blood on it, it becomes much harder to argue against. There is a particular danger in this kind of moment. A crisis can clarify, but it can also flatten. It can make complicated things look simple. Korea had its own history, its own civil tensions, its own leaders, its own violence before 1950, its own hopes and tragedies. But inside Washington, the invasion quickly became evidence in a larger case. It was read through the lens of global communism. The local became global. The specific became symbolic. North Korea was not only North Korea, it was a test of whether aggression would be resisted. South Korea was not only South Korea, it was a test of whether American promises meant anything. The 38th parallel was not only a line across a peninsula, it was one edge of a worldwide boundary between systems. Once policymakers began thinking this way, it became almost impossible for any conflict to remain small in their minds. A strike in one country, an election in another, a guerrilla movement in another, a coup, a border clash, a labour uprising, a colonial rebellion, all of it could be interpreted as part of one expanding pattern. That was the mental shift Korea accelerated. Containment stopped being a policy for certain vital regions and became a habit of scanning the entire globe for signs of infection. This was not just paranoia, though paranoia certainly fed it. Communist movements did coordinate across borders. The Soviet Union did support friendly parties and regimes. China did become an active revolutionary power in Asia. North Korea did invade the South. None of that was imaginary. But the American response gradually lost the ability to distinguish carefully between different kinds of communism, nationalism, anti-colonial struggle, social reform, and local rebellion. To a farmer in Vietnam fighting French colonial rule, communism might mean land, independence, discipline, and a route to power. To an American official reading reports in Washington, it might mean Moscow or Beijing advancing another square. This difference in perception mattered enormously. Korea taught Washington that the cost of underestimating a local communist force could be sudden war. The lesson many officials took was not study each place more carefully. It was do not let another Korea happen. That phrase would become a shadow hanging over later decisions. No one wanted to be the person who failed to act before the next invasion, the next collapse, the next test of American will. One of the clearest results was the militarization of containment. That word sounds technical, but the change was very physical. It meant money moving into weapons. It meant factories receiving contracts. It meant young men drafted or kept in uniform. It meant bases expanded and supplied. It meant ships in the Pacific, airfields in Japan, troops in Europe, advisors in Asia, planners drawing lines and circles across maps. The defense budget rose dramatically during the Korean War. The United States did not merely pay for the conflict and then return to the old level of spending. The war created a new baseline. What had seemed excessive before the invasion now seemed responsible. What had seemed like militarized anxiety now seemed like prudence. A country that had once treated demobilization as the natural reward of victory now treated readiness as the necessary price of survival. Japan is a good place to see this transformation. Only 5 years earlier, Japan had been the defeated enemy, occupied by American forces, disarmed, and remade under a pacifist constitution. But the Korean War made Japan strategically indispensable almost overnight. American bases in Japan became essential staging grounds for the war. Japanese industry supplied repairs, equipment, and logistics. The war helped revive Japan's economy and pushed American planners to see Japan not simply as a former enemy to be supervised, but as a future partner in the containment system. This is one of history's sharp turns. The country America had fought across the Pacific became a pillar of America's Cold War position in Asia. The logic was practical. If communism was advancing in Asia, then Japan had to be stable, prosperous, and aligned with the United States. Containment was no longer only about stopping enemies. It was about building and maintaining a whole structure of friendly states strong enough to resist pressure. Taiwan was another place where Korea changed the map. Before the war, Truman's administration had been cautious about becoming too deeply tied to Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government after its retreat from mainland China. But once Korea erupted, the United States moved to prevent the conflict from spreading and sent the 7th Fleet into the Taiwan Strait. Suddenly Taiwan was drawn more firmly into the American defensive perimeter in Asia. The Korean War made it much harder for Washington to separate one Asian crisis from another. If Korea fell, what would happen to Japan? If Taiwan fell, what would that mean for the Philippines? If Indochina fell, would the whole region shift? This chain thinking became central to American strategy. It did not yet have the full popular form of the domino theory, but the pieces were already being lined up. The fear was not only that one country might change sides. The fear was that one change would make the next change easier, and the next, until American power looked unreliable everywhere. This is how containment became permanent mission. A mission has no simple finish line. A war can end, at least in theory. A mission continues because the condition it addresses continues. If the mission is to contain communism everywhere it might expand, then the United States can never fully stand down while communism exists anywhere with ambition. That is a very different kind of national purpose from winning a war. It is open-ended. It requires constant interpretation. It creates its own experts, departments, committees, and industries. It rewards people who warn of danger more than people who say a place may not matter as much as we think. No official wants to be remembered as the one who dismissed a threat that later became a crisis. So the system leans toward action. Not always invasion, not always open war, but aid, advisors, arms, covert operations, treaties, bases, shows of force, and the steady habit of involvement. Korea made that involvement feel like the cost of avoiding catastrophe. There is something quietly exhausting about this shift. Imagine living in a country where every horizon contains a possible test. Europe must be defended. Asia must be watched. The Middle East must be assessed. Latin America must be protected from subversion. Africa, as decolonization accelerates, must be studied for signs of alignment. Elections abroad become matters of American anxiety. Labour unions abroad become matters of American anxiety. Student groups, newspapers, military officers, kings, colonels, peasants, priests and professors all become part of the intelligence picture. The world becomes crowded with signals. That is what permanent containment did to the American state. It trained it to look everywhere. Once you look everywhere for danger, you will always find something real enough to justify looking harder. Korea also changed the emotional meaning of allies. In the older American tradition, alliances were often seen as temporary arrangements, useful in war but dangerous as permanent entanglements. George Washington's farewell warning against permanent alliances still lingered as a kind of ancestral caution, even if the modern world had already outrun it. After World War II, NATO had marked a major break with that tradition. Korea deepened the break. The United States increasingly defined its own security through the security of others. South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Western Europe, later South Vietnam, all became linked in arguments about credibility. If America abandoned one, would the others doubt it? If allies doubted it, would enemies move? If enemies moved, would the whole system weaken? The result was a kind of strategic chain that could bind the United States to places not because each one was directly vital in isolation, but because leaders feared the meaning of losing any one link. Credibility is one of those words that sounds calm until you examine what it demands. It asks a country to act not only for what is happening now, but for how future observers might interpret the action. In Korea, credibility meant showing that the United States would resist aggression after the communist victory in China. In Vietnam, credibility would mean showing that America's promises in Asia still meant something. In later years, credibility would be invoked in different forms, in different places by different presidents. The danger is that credibility can make war self-reinforcing. Once troops are committed, withdrawal looks like weakness. Once casualties are suffered, stopping can look like betrayal. Once leaders say a place is vital, admitting limits becomes politically painful. Korea taught Washington that credibility could require fighting. It also taught Washington that credibility could require continuing to fight, even when victory became unclear. The irony is that Korea also showed the limits of military power. The United States and its allies prevented the conquest of South Korea, which was a real and consequential achievement. But they did not unify the peninsula. They did not destroy North Korean communism. They did not force China back into passivity. They did not produce a peace treaty. After 3 years of terrible fighting, the line settled close to where it had begun. If containment had been understood modestly, Korea might have taught a narrow lesson. Resist aggression, but understand limits. Instead, it taught 2 lessons at once, and American policy often emphasized the more expansive one. It taught that force could prevent collapse, and this was true. It also seemed to teach that without force, collapse would spread everywhere, and this became the dangerous habit. The success of saving South Korea made military containment credible. The failure to achieve total victory made permanent readiness seem necessary. Both outcomes strengthened the system. For ordinary Americans, the transformation was easy to miss because it did not arrive as a single announcement. No one came to the door and said, "Your country has now accepted a permanent global military mission." Instead, it appeared in taxes, drafts, headlines, school maps, civil defense drills, newsreels, speeches about freedom, and warnings about subversion. It appeared in the growing presence of military language in political life. It appeared in the sense that every president had to prove toughness. It appeared in the way children learned to duck under desks because nuclear war was now thinkable. It appeared in veterans returning from Korea to a country that wanted to move on, but not fully examine what had just changed. It appeared in the quiet assumption that somewhere, always, America would be watching a frontier. The mission also reshaped domestic politics. To question a military commitment could be made to look like weakness toward communism. The early 1950s were the years of McCarthyism, loyalty investigations, blacklists, and accusations that communist influence had penetrated American institutions. Foreign policy and domestic suspicion fed each other. If communism was a worldwide conspiracy probing every weakness, then dissent at home could be framed as dangerous softness or hidden sympathy. This made containment more than an overseas strategy. It became part of American identity politics. Politicians competed to sound firm. Officials feared being accused of having lost another country. The phrase, "who lost China," haunted them. No one wanted to hear who lost Korea, who lost Vietnam, who lost Iran, who lost Cuba. The grammar itself was revealing, as if nations around the world were objects held in American hands, and any movement away from Washington was a theft or a failure of grip. Korea hardened that grammar. It made the map feel accountable to America. It encouraged the belief that distant outcomes were not merely events but judgments on American will. This is one of the clearest signs of a country moving toward permanent war habits. It begins to experience the independence of other peoples as a referendum on itself. A revolution abroad becomes an insult. A neutral government becomes a disappointment. A nationalist leader who refuses alignment becomes a problem. A civil war becomes a test. The United States did not invent this kind of imperial thinking. Great powers had done it for centuries. But Korea gave it a Cold War democratic language. America was not conquering, it said. It was defending freedom. It was not seeking empire, it said. It was maintaining stability. Often there was sincerity in this language. Many people under communist regimes wanted protection. Many allies genuinely wanted American support. But sincerity does not cancel power. The language of defense can still create a system in which war is always waiting nearby. The Korean Peninsula itself became the living symbol of this permanent mission. After the armistice, American troops stayed in South Korea. The demilitarized zone became one of the most heavily guarded borders in the world. The war did not end in a peace settlement. It settled into armed suspension. Here was containment made visible. Two systems facing each other across a line. Soldiers watching soldiers. Families divided. Propaganda loudspeakers, patrols, mines, barbed wire, and the constant possibility that the frozen conflict could thaw. The United States could point to South Korea and say, "This is why we remain." And in one sense, the argument gained strength over time. South Korea eventually became one of the great economic and democratic success stories of the post-war world, though only after long years of authoritarian rule, protest, repression, and struggle. But the success did not undo the habit. It reinforced the belief that long-term military commitment could produce favourable outcomes if a country was willing to stay long enough. That belief would become tempting elsewhere, even where the conditions were very different. Indochina is where the shadow lengthens. During the Korean War, American aid to the French war effort against the communist-led Viet Minh increased dramatically. France was trying to hold on to its colonial position, though it described the struggle increasingly in anti-communist terms. For Washington, the conflict in Vietnam began to look less like a colonial war and more like another front in containment. This was one of the most consequential interpretive shifts of the era. Once anti-colonial nationalism was folded into the Cold War map, the United States found itself supporting old empires or authoritarian allies in the name of freedom. That contradiction would grow more damaging over time. Korea did not cause Vietnam by itself. Nothing that large has one cause. But Korea made it easier for American officials to believe that a communist victory in one Asian country could not be treated as local, that the United States had to invest, advise, support, and eventually fight if the line seemed in danger of breaking. The permanent mission also needed permanent explanation. Americans had to be told why this level of involvement was necessary. Speeches became part of the structure. Presidents explained that free peoples depended on American resolve. Secretaries of State spoke of aggression and weakness and lessons of history. Military leaders described readiness as deterrence. Newspapers mapped crises into the language of red expansion and free world defense. Over time, this language became familiar enough that it no longer needed full explanation. A crisis would occur, and the old phrases would rise almost automatically. We must not appease, we must show resolve. We must defend freedom, we must honour commitments, we must stop aggression before it spreads. Some of these phrases pointed to real concerns, but phrases used too often can become substitutes for thought. Korea helped establish the vocabulary that later crises would inherit. There is a human cost to living inside permanent mission even when you're not the one fighting. A country organised around constant danger becomes less able to imagine rest. Its politics reward alarm. Its budgets favour preparedness. Its leaders fear the accusation of softness more than the risk of overreach. Its citizens grow accustomed to the idea that somewhere, beyond the edge of normal life, soldiers are standing watch in their name. This can produce gratitude, but it can also produce distance. War becomes both constant and remote. It is always present in policy but absent from most dinner tables unless a family member serves. That distance allows the mission to continue. People can oppose a specific war, mourn specific losses, argue over specific presidents, and still leave untouched the deeper assumption that America must remain globally armed, globally alert, globally responsible. Korea was the training ground for that assumption. It taught the United States to treat containment not as an emergency measure but as a standing duty. It taught officials that military power was not the last resort after diplomacy failed, but part of the everyday architecture of diplomacy itself. It taught presidents that credibility could bind them to distant conflicts. It taught Congress that funding a mission could be easier than openly debating its limits. It taught allies to depend on American presence and enemies to test it. It taught defense planners that the next war might come quickly, with little warning, in a place where weakness had been underestimated. And once those lessons were absorbed, they did not remain attached only to Korea, they travelled. By the middle of the 1950s, the United States had become something it had once claimed to distrust, a peacetime military superpower with worldwide commitments. It had not done this because Americans loved war in any simple sense. Most did not. It had done it because fear, responsibility, ambition, memory and habit had fused into a system. Korea gave that system its first major battlefield. It showed how a local war could justify a global posture. It showed how containment could move from paper to blood, from doctrine to budget, from warning to institution. And once institutions grow around a mission, they develop interests of their own. They require offices, personnel, supply chains, contracts, research labs, airfields, shipyards, factories, and congressional districts that benefit from the money flowing through them. The mission that began as a response to danger starts building a domestic foundation that makes it harder to dismantle even when the immediate danger changes shape. That is where the next part of the story waits, because Korea did not only turn containment into a permanent mission overseas, it helped build a permanent war economy at home, a network of industries, military commands, research centres, lobbyists, weapons programs, and political incentives that would make preparation for war one of the central engines of American life. The battlefield was thousands of miles away, but the contracts, factories, laboratories and budgets were right there in the United States, quietly changing what the country made, what it feared, and what it came to depend on. The battlefield was in Korea, but one of the most lasting changes happened in places that looked nothing like battlefields. It happened in offices where budget numbers were revised upward. It happened in aircraft plants where production lines that might have slowed after World War II found new life. It happened in shipyards, steel mills, electronics laboratories, university research departments, congressional districts, and military planning rooms where the next war was no longer treated as a possibility to be feared in some distant future, but as a condition that had to be prepared for every day. Korea did not invent the American arms industry. World War II had already shown what the United States could become when its factories, scientists, engineers, soldiers, and politicians were all pointed in the same direction. But World War II had been understood as an emergency. Korea helped turn emergency production into a lasting habit. It made military spending feel less like a temporary surge and more like the basic cost of being America in the Cold War. Before Korea, there was still a chance, at least in the minds of many Americans, that the country might step down from the wartime footing it had reached in the 1940s. This was an old American instinct. After major wars, the United States had usually reduced its military sharply. The army shrank, soldiers went home, ships were mothballed, factories returned to civilian production. There had always been suspicion of large permanent armies, not only because they were expensive, but because they seemed politically dangerous. A huge standing military belonged, in the older American imagination, to empires, monarchies, and nervous states surrounded by enemies. The United States preferred to think of itself differently. It could raise power when needed, win, demobilize, and return to civilian life. That idea was already strained by World War II and the rise of the Soviet Union, but it had not fully died. Korea did not kill it with an argument. Korea killed it with urgency. The numbers tell part of the story, but they do not tell all of it. In the late 1940s, American defense spending had dropped far below the enormous levels of World War II. That seemed natural. The war was over. Men were coming home. Families wanted houses, washing machines, cars, college educations, and children, not another decade of rationing and barracks life. There were still occupation duties in Germany and Japan, and the Cold War was becoming more serious, but the political appetite for a massive peacetime military budget was limited. Then North Korea invaded South Korea, and suddenly every warning from defense planners sounded less like alarmism and more like realism. Requests that had seemed too large became necessary. Programs that might have been postponed became urgent. Production that had slowed needed to be restarted. The Korean War created the political permission for a military build-up that many strategists had already wanted but had not yet been able to sell fully to the public. This is where the habit begins. A government learns what it can ask for during fear. Industries learn what they can build during fear. Members of Congress learn how much money can flow into their states and districts during fear. Universities learn that research money can arrive when national security is attached to it. The military learns that a crisis can turn plans into appropriations. None of this requires cartoonish corruption. That is important. The system did not form because everyone involved was secretly plotting endless war. Many were sincere. Many believed the Soviet threat was real, and it was real. Many believed the United States had been caught underprepared in Korea, and in important ways it had been. Many believed that weakness invited aggression, and the invasion seemed to prove it. But sincerity does not prevent a habit from forming. A habit forms when a response that makes sense in one emergency becomes the default response to every danger that follows. The defense companies understood the change quickly because their survival depended on understanding government demand. During World War II, companies like Boeing, Lockheed, Douglas, North American Aviation, General Dynamics and others had become central to the production of American military power. They built bombers, fighters, transports, engines, weapon systems, and the parts that made larger systems possible. After 1945, there was uncertainty. What would happen to all that capacity? Civilian aviation was growing, yes, but it could not absorb everything. The Korean War answered the question. The state would remain a customer. Not at World War II levels forever, but at levels large enough to keep a permanent defence sector alive and politically important. The military did not simply buy rifles and boots. It bought aircraft, tanks, ships, radar, communications equipment, ammunition, trucks, medical supplies, fuel systems, and later missiles and advanced electronics. Each purchase had a contractor. Each contractor had workers. Each factory had a town around it. Each town had representatives in Congress who understood what those jobs meant. There is a quiet political transformation hidden in that last point. Once military spending becomes employment, it becomes much harder to reduce. A weapons program is never only a weapons program. It is also a payroll. It is also a local tax base. It is also a machine shop, a supplier, a subcontractor, a family business making a small component, a diner full at lunchtime, a school funded by the prosperity of the surrounding community. When a senator defends a military contract, he may speak about national security, and he may believe it. But he is also defending jobs at home. When a representative argues that a base must remain open, she may speak about readiness, and readiness may matter. But she is also protecting the economy of a district. Korea helped to deepen this connection between permanent military preparation and ordinary American prosperity. The war economy did not feel separate from civilian life anymore. It entered civilian life through wages, mortgages, college towns, research grants, and factory shifts. California is one of the clearest examples. Southern California had already grown during World War II into a major centre of aircraft production and military industry. The Korean War helped sustain and expand that world. Factories that had built for the last war could build for the Cold War. Engineers who had designed wartime aircraft could design jet aircraft, missile systems and electronics for the new age. Communities grew around defence work. The weather was mild, land was available, airfields were present, and military contracts helped turn the region into one of the great centres of the Cold War economy. But this was not only a California story. Texas, Washington, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Ohio, Missouri, New York, and many other states had their own pieces of the system. Shipyards, engine plants, ordnance factories, research laboratories, and military bases spread the benefits widely enough that defence spending became a national political structure rather than a narrow special interest. The technological side of this story matters because Korea arrived at a moment when war itself was changing. World War II had ended with propeller aircraft still central to combat, but the jet age was beginning. In Korea, American pilots flew F-86 Sabres against Soviet-designed MiG-15S in some of the first major jet-versus-jet combat in history. That changed what air power seemed to require. Speed, altitude, radar, training, maintenance, and advanced design became even more important. The lesson was not simply that America needed more planes, it needed better planes, faster development, stronger research links, and a pipeline that connected military requirements to private industry and scientific expertise. The same was true across weapon systems. Artillery, tanks, communications, logistics, medical evacuation, helicopters and air support all drew attention. A permanent mission required permanent innovation. The country could not wait until a war began, and then start inventing what it needed. It had to fund the future before the future arrived. Universities became part of this world in ways that are easy to underestimate. During World War II, scientific research had been drawn deeply into military needs, most famously through the Manhattan Project and radar development. After Korea, the relationship between universities, federal money and national security became more durable. Physics, engineering, mathematics, materials science, aeronautics, electronics, and later computing all had military relevance. grants and contracts flowed through institutions that did not look, from the outside, like arms factories. A laboratory on a campus could be part of the same security structure as an aircraft plant. A graduate student working on a technical problem might be connected indirectly to air defense, submarine detection, missile guidance, or communications. This did not mean all science became militarized, or that every scientist welcomed the arrangement. But it did mean that the Cold War state became one of the great sponsors of American research, and Korea strengthened the argument that this sponsorship was not optional. The habit also changed how the military planned. If the United States had to be ready for another Korea, then readiness could not be improvised. The first months of the war had exposed weaknesses in training, equipment, ammunition supplies, and force structure. Task Force Smith became a symbol of what happened when underprepared troops were sent into combat against a serious enemy. Military planners remembered that. They used it as a warning. Never again should American troops be rushed into battle without proper equipment. Never again should the country assume that a small tripwire force or symbolic presence would be enough. Never again should demobilization go so far that the first response to crisis was desperation. These were understandable lessons, but they also supported permanent expansion. Every warning about being unprepared became an argument for more spending now, more planning now, more capacity now, because the next test might come without warning. There is something very human in that. If you were responsible for soldiers' lives and you had watched unprepared units suffer in Korea, you would not want to repeat it. If you were a parent, you would want the government to give your son the best equipment possible. If you were a commander, you would want enough ammunition, enough winter clothing, enough radios, enough aircraft, enough reserves. Preparedness is not a sinister word. It is a humane word when the alternative is sending people into danger without what they need. That is why the military-industrial habit is so difficult to criticize honestly. It is built partly on real obligations. Soldiers should not be neglected. Allies should not be defended with empty promises. A serious country should not pretend danger does not exist. But the same humane argument can become endless. There is always one more shortage to fix, one more vulnerability to close, one more enemy capability to match, one more future crisis to imagine. Preparedness has no natural stopping point. Korea also made the defense budget feel like a measure of national seriousness. In peacetime politics, domestic spending and military spending compete for attention and money. Roads, schools, hospitals, housing, scientific research, veterans' care, and military procurement all draw from public resources. But during the Cold War, defense spending gained a special moral armor. To oppose it could be made to look naive. To question a weapons program could be made to look irresponsible. To ask whether every commitment was necessary could be made to look like weakness toward communism. This did not silence debate entirely, but it shaped the terrain. Advocates of high defense spending could point to Korea and say, "This is what happens when we are not ready." That phrase is politically powerful because it shifts the burden onto the skeptic. The person who wants restraint must prove that restraint will not invite disaster. The person who wants more spending only has to point to the last disaster and ask whether anyone wants to risk another. The press and popular culture helped make the New World familiar. Newsreels, newspapers, radio reports, and later television brought images of Korea into American homes, though not with the same total emotional force as World War II. At the same time, the broader culture of the early 1950s absorbed Cold War anxiety. Children learned about air raids, families heard about civil defense, magazines explained bomb shelters. Films and radio dramas imagined spies, traitors, invasions, and atomic danger. The military was not just an institution somewhere far away. It became part of the background of ordinary thought. The country was prosperous, but the prosperity sat beside dread. A new refrigerator could be advertised in the same society that told children to duck and cover. A family could buy a suburban house, while the federal government planned for nuclear war. That combination sounds strange only if we assume peace and danger cannot coexist. Korea helped teach Americans that they could. The habit reached into the presidency as well. A president after Korea inherited not only armed forces, but a vast security apparatus with expectations of use. Advisors would arrive with options. The Pentagon would have plans. Intelligence agencies would have assessments. Allies would request reassurance. Contractors would provide capabilities. Congress would argue over funding, but the machinery itself would remain. This matters because tools shape decisions. A country with a large, ready, global military has options that a smaller, less deployed country does not. Those options can prevent disaster. They can also tempt action. When aircraft carriers exist, they can be sent. When bases surround a region, operations can be launched. When advisors are already present, escalation can be described as support. When weapons have been developed at great cost, there is pressure to justify their existence. The machine does not force every decision, but it changes the menu placed in front of every president. Dwight Eisenhower understood this better than almost anyone, which is why his later warning about the military-industrial complex carries such weight. He was not a pacifist. He was not naive about power. He had commanded the largest coalition war effort in American history. He knew what armies required. He knew what industry could do. He knew how essential organization, logistics, and production were to victory. When he warned that a conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry was new in American experience, he was speaking as someone who had helped manage the older emergency version of that relationship and had watched the permanent version take root. His warning came in 1961, years after the Korean armistice, but Korea was part of the background that made it necessary. The war had helped normalize exactly the condition he described: a peacetime country with a wartime-scale security system. What makes Eisenhower's warning so interesting is that he did not describe the danger as a simple conspiracy. He spoke of misplaced power, whether sought or unsought. That phrase matters. The power of the military-industrial system did not depend only on people asking for it openly. It grew because institutions accumulated influence by being necessary. The Pentagon needed contractors. Contractors needed appropriations. Congress controlled appropriations but also benefited from the jobs. Universities needed research money. Scientists needed laboratories. Communities needed bases. Presidents needed capabilities. Allies needed reassurance. Each relationship made sense by itself. Together they formed a structure that could steer the country, even without one person steering it. That is the nature of a habit. No single cigarette explains an addiction. No single budget explains a military-industrial state. The repetition is the thing. Korea's role in that repetition was early and decisive. It showed that the Cold War could turn hot without warning. It showed that American forces might have to fight outside Europe. It showed that allies and clients could become battlefronts. It showed that conventional war remained possible even in the nuclear age. This last point is especially important. After 1945, some people assumed the atomic bomb had changed war so completely that future great power conflict would either be avoided or become instantly catastrophic. Korea proved that a different kind of war could continue under the nuclear shadow. The United States and China could fight directly, yet the conflict could remain limited enough to avoid nuclear exchange. That was both a relief and a danger. It meant the world might not end every time major powers collided. It also meant limited wars could become thinkable instruments of policy. If nuclear weapons made total war too dangerous, then conventional forces had to be maintained for the wars that could still be fought. This helped justify a balanced but enormous military establishment. Nuclear weapons alone were not enough. The United States needed infantry, marines, aircraft carriers, tactical aircraft, bombers, transports, tanks, artillery, intelligence systems, and logistics networks. It needed the ability to fight in mountains, cities, islands, jungles, deserts, and oceans. Every scenario required different equipment. Every equipment category required procurement. Every procurement line created supporters. The military-industrial habit was not only about bombs and missiles, it was about the whole ecosystem of readiness. Boots, tents, engines, radios, spare parts, fuel, medical supplies, and winter coats all belonged to the system. Korea had shown what happened when winter clothing was inadequate, when terrain was underestimated, when supply lines stretched too far. The practical lessons of the war became budgetary arguments for years. There was another effect, less visible, but very important. The war strengthened secrecy. Military planning, intelligence estimates, weapons development, and alliance commitments increasingly happened inside classified systems. The public could not evaluate what it could not see. Officials could always say that dangers existed beyond what could safely be disclosed. Sometimes they were right. Governments do need secrecy in matters of war, but secrecy also protects mistakes, exaggerations, and institutional self-interest. When a permanent mission depends on classified threat assessments, democratic oversight becomes harder. Korea unfolded in the early years of the national security state created after World War II, including the Department of Defense, the National Security Council, and the Central Intelligence Agency. The war gave these institutions immediate relevance. They were no longer peacetime reorganizations on paper. They were tools in an active global struggle. The home front adapted in ways that felt normal because they were gradual. A young engineer might graduate and take a job with a defence contractor because that was where the best work was. A town might welcome a base expansion because it meant stable paychecks. A university might build a lab with federal support because the research was prestigious and well-funded. A member of Congress might defend a weapons program because cancelling it would hurt local employment. A president might approve a build-up because advisors warned of another Korea. Nobody in that chain has to think of himself as addicted to war. He is employed, responsible, patriotic, cautious, practical. The addiction sits not in any one person's mind, but in the pattern connecting them. This is why the Korean War is so important to understanding later American history. By the time Vietnam escalated, the United States already had the language, the bases, the industries, the contractors, the research networks, the planning habits, and the political incentives required to sustain a long conflict far from home. Vietnam would tear the country apart emotionally in a way Korea did not, but much of the machinery had already been strengthened in the early 1950s. By the time of later wars, the machinery would be even more advanced and even harder to separate from ordinary politics. Defence spending would become one of the few areas where huge sums could be justified through fear, patriotism, jobs, and technology at the same time. That combination is extremely durable. It is worth being fair here. The military-industrial system did not produce only waste or danger. It produced real capabilities. It helped deter Soviet aggression in Europe. It supported allies who feared communist invasion. It funded technologies that later shaped civilian life. It maintained forces that could respond to crises. It contributed to the defense of South Korea, which survived under the American security umbrella. A simplistic story would say the whole system was only greed. That would be too easy and not true enough. The harder truth is that the system was built from both necessity and excess. Real threats created real needs. Real needs created institutions. Institutions created incentives to grow. Growth created dependence. Dependence made restraint difficult. By the end of the Korean War, the United States had learned to live with a defense establishment that earlier generations would have found alarming. The country still held elections. It still argued fiercely. It still had civilian control. It was not a military dictatorship, and it did not become one. But war preparation had moved closer to the centre of national life. The economy, science, politics, foreign policy and local employment were now tied more tightly to military readiness than before. The habit had formed quietly, not because Americans wanted endless war, but because they wanted security, influence, jobs, reassurance, and protection from being surprised again. Those desires are understandable. They're also exactly the kind of desires that can keep a war system alive long after the first emergency has passed. So when we imagine the Korean War, we should not picture only the ridgelines, the frozen reservoirs, the artillery, or the armistice table at Panmunjom. We should also picture the factory floor back home, bright with overhead lights late into the evening. We should picture a procurement officer signing another order, a senator receiving news of jobs in his state, an engineer testing a new aircraft component, a university laboratory accepting a defence grant, a town growing around an airbase, a president reading a memo that says the next crisis may come sooner than expected. This was the other war, the one that did not stop when the armistice was signed. It did not look like combat. It looked like preparation, and preparation, repeated long enough, became a way of life. The next question is what that did to the presidency itself, because a permanent military machine does not operate in a vacuum. Someone has to command it. Someone has to decide when readiness becomes action, when a warning becomes an intervention, when an ally's crisis becomes America's responsibility, and when troops can be sent before the country has fully understood where they're going. Korea did not only build the habit of permanent preparation, it gave presidents a new model for using that preparation quickly, sometimes without the old constitutional rituals, and often with the argument that the world was moving too fast to wait. The man at the centre of this change did not look, at first glance, like someone who would permanently alter the way America went to war. Harry Truman was not a grand figure in the way Franklin Roosevelt had been grand. He did not have Roosevelt's voice, that patrician calm that could enter millions of homes and make catastrophe feel manageable. He did not have Eisenhower's military legend, or Kennedy's Polish, or Johnson's sheer physical force of personality. Truman looked like a man who had been pulled from a county courthouse, given a stack of papers too large for any one person to read, and told that the fate of the world now expected him to make decisions before breakfast. There was something almost ordinary about him, and that ordinariness matters because the precedent he set in Korea did not arrive wrapped in imperial ceremony. It arrived through a president who believed he was acting responsibly in a crisis, a president who thought the world had become too dangerous for hesitation, a president who learned under pressure that American forces could be sent into major combat without Congress first declaring war. That is the uncomfortable thing about historical turning points. They do not always feel like turning points to the people inside them. Truman did not wake up in June 1950 and say to himself that he was going to weaken Congress's war power for generations. He did not announce that future presidents would use Korea as a model, directly or indirectly, whenever they wanted speed, flexibility, or room to act before the country had fully debated the cost. He thought North Korea had invaded South Korea, and that if the United States did not respond, the world would learn a terrible lesson. He thought the United Nations had to mean something. He thought the memory of the 1930s was still close enough to warn him what happened when aggression was allowed to proceed unchecked. He thought, as many men around him thought, that communism was testing the will of the free world. The decision felt urgent, moral, practical, and defensive. That is exactly why it was so powerful. A dangerous precedent rarely introduces itself as dangerous. It introduces itself as necessary. Truman had come into the presidency in 1945 with almost no preparation for the scale of what awaited him. Roosevelt had kept him poorly informed. Within months, Truman had to confront the end of the war in Europe, the atomic bombing of Japan, the beginning of the nuclear age, the occupation of defeated nations, the creation of the United Nations, tensions with the Soviet Union, labour unrest at home, inflation, demobilization, and the question of what kind of country America would become after the greatest war in its history. He was a president of aftermath, and aftermath is rarely peaceful. People imagine aftermath as the quiet after the storm, but in government aftermath is when the bills arrive, the alliances crack. The promises made during war become difficult to keep, and the enemies who stood together against one danger begin measuring one another again. By 1950, Truman had already watched the Cold War harden. He had already committed America to the Truman Doctrine. He had already supported the Marshall Plan. He had already endured the shock of China's communist revolution and the Soviet atomic bomb. He did not see Korea as an isolated thunderclap. He saw it as the next sound in a storm already overhead. When the North Korean army crossed the 38th parallel, Truman's instinct was immediate action. The speed mattered. Officials in Washington feared that South Korea might collapse quickly. The South Korean army was not prepared to stop the invasion alone. Seoul was vulnerable. The United States had forces nearby in Japan, but those forces were occupation troops, not a fully prepared invasion army waiting for a clean mission. The first American unit sent into Korea would suffer badly, partly because the United States had allowed its conventional readiness to decline after World War II. To Truman and his advisers, that underpreparedness was not an argument for staying out. It was an argument for moving faster and rebuilding strength at the same time. This is one of the first patterns that Korea fixed into American policy. A crisis exposes weakness, and the answer becomes not only intervention now, but expansion later. The president acts because there is no time. Then the country spends because it must never be caught like that again. The constitutional question sat there from the beginning, but it did not stop the movement. Truman did not ask Congress for a declaration of war. He acted through the authority he believed he possessed as Commander-in-Chief, and through the framework of the United Nations Security Council resolutions. That combination was new in its scale. The United Nations had condemned the invasion and called on member states to help South Korea. Truman saw that as enough. He also believed, or at least argued, that as president he had the authority to send American forces to support that collective action. The old constitutional ritual was treated as unnecessary, perhaps even too slow for the world as it now existed. And this is where you can feel the 20th century pressing against the 18th. The Constitution had been written in an age of sailing ships, slow messages, and wars that took months to organise. The Korean crisis unfolded by cable, telephone, aircraft, and armoured columns. Truman's world moved faster than Madison's world. That did not erase the Constitution, but it changed the pressure placed upon it. There is something almost seductive about speed in foreign policy. Speed feels strong. Speed feels serious. Speed allows a leader to appear ahead of events rather than trapped beneath them. In a crisis, the person asking for deliberation can sound like the person asking to do nothing. That is deeply unfair sometimes, but politically it works. Truman could say that South Korea needed help now, not after weeks of congressional argument. He could say that the United Nations had acted and America had to honour the principle of collective security. He could say that this was not a private American war but an international response to aggression. Those arguments had force, but they also changed the habit of decision. If the president could commit troops first and explain the legal theory afterward, then Congress's role moved from gatekeeper to supporter, critic, funder, or frustrated spectator. Congress still had power, but the timing of that power had shifted. Before troops are sent, Congress can stop a war from beginning. After troops are sent, stopping the war feels like abandoning men already in the field. This is one of the most important political tricks that history teaches, though it is not always performed cynically. Once soldiers are committed, the argument changes its emotional temperature. A senator who might have opposed intervention in theory now has to decide whether cutting support will endanger American troops. A citizen who might have questioned the mission now hears that boys from his town are already fighting. A newspaper that demanded clarity now reports casualties. The country moves from decision to loyalty, from debate to endurance. Truman may not have designed Korea to work this way, but the effect was real. Future presidents would understand it. The first deployment creates a fact. That fact creates obligation. Obligation creates momentum. Momentum can carry a country far beyond the first explanation. There were members of Congress who objected. Some believed Truman had exceeded his authority. Some worried that if the president could fight a major war under United Nations authority, then the power to declare war had been hollowed out. Senator Robert Taft was one of the clearest critics. He argued that Truman had no constitutional right to send troops into Korea without congressional approval. But Taft's argument, though serious, could not overcome the political climate of 1950. Anti-communism was too strong. The fear of appearing weak was too sharp. The memory of World War II and appeasement was too useful. The invasion itself was too clear an act of aggression. It is hard to build a constitutional confrontation when the enemy is moving, allies are watching, and soldiers are dying. So Congress complained, questioned, funded, and adapted. In doing so, it helped build the very precedent some members feared. The public also adapted. Most Americans were not reading constitutional law. They were reading headlines. They were trying to understand why their country, only recently returned from one world war, had found itself fighting in Korea. The phrase police action helped manage that confusion. It suggested something smaller than war, something disciplined and lawful, something done to restore order rather than pursue victory in the old sense. Truman himself did not want Korea to become World War III. He did not want a massive open-ended war with China and the Soviet Union, so the language of limitation had a real purpose. But limitation did not make the war small to the people inside it. It made the politics easier at first and then more confusing later. If this was not war, why were so many men being killed? If this was only a police action, why did it require so much blood? If America was not formally at war, why did families feel the same fear they had felt in the 1940s? That confusion exposed a new kind of presidential power. Truman could define the conflict in a way that gave him flexibility. He could say America was resisting aggression, but not seeking total war. He could send troops, but insist on limits. He could fight under the United Nations flag, but American power remained the center of the effort. He could avoid a declaration of war, but still wage war in every practical sense. The presidency became the place where language, law, force, and urgency were braided together, and once braided, they were hard to pull apart. Later presidents would use different words, but the structure would feel familiar. Advisory mission, limited operation, retaliatory strike, peacekeeping, humanitarian intervention, counter-terrorism operation, authorization to use military force. Not all of these were the same, and not all were illegitimate, but Korea showed how much could be done without the old sentence. Congress declares war. Then came MacArthur, and with him the deeper question of who controlled the limits of an undeclared war. Douglas MacArthur was not content to be merely an instrument of policy. He was a man with a world historical sense of himself, and in fairness, history had often rewarded that sense. His landing at Incheon in September 1950 was one of the most daring and successful operations of the war. It changed the momentum almost overnight. North Korean forces, which had driven South Korean and American troops into the Pusan perimeter, suddenly found themselves threatened from the rear. Seoul was recaptured. The North Korean army began to collapse. For a brief moment, Truman's decision seemed not only justified but brilliantly vindicated. Intervention had worked. American power had reversed aggression. The United Nations mission seemed capable of doing more than restoring South Korea. It might eliminate North Korea entirely. This was the dangerous moment after success, the moment when a limited aim begins to feel too modest. If the enemy is retreating, why stop at the original line? If the chance exists to unify Korea, why leave the communist regime in place? If American troops have already suffered, why not finish the job? These questions are not foolish. They arise naturally in war, but they are also how wars expand. Truman's administration allowed United Nations forces to move north of the 38th parallel. MacArthur advanced toward the Yalu River, near China's border. Warnings came that China might intervene if hostile forces approached too closely. MacArthur discounted those warnings or believed Chinese intervention could be handled. Then Chinese forces entered the war in massive numbers, and the conflict transformed. American and United Nations troops were thrown into retreat. The war that had seemed almost won became a brutal struggle against a new enemy. This is where Truman learned another presidential lesson, one almost opposite the first. He had learned that he could enter a major conflict without asking Congress for a declaration. Now he had to learn that he also had to restrain the war he had entered. MacArthur wanted escalation. He believed the war against China should be expanded, that Chinese bases and supply lines beyond Korea should not be safe. That victory required broader action. Truman feared that MacArthur's approach could ignite a general war in Asia and perhaps draw in the Soviet Union. Nuclear weapons hung over the debate. The United States had them. The Soviet Union had tested them. The idea of another world war was no longer only the nightmare of trenches and bombers. It was the possibility of atomic destruction. So Truman held the line. Not the geographical line at first, but the political line. Korea would remain limited. China would not be bombed into a larger war. MacArthur would not be allowed to publicly challenge civilian authority. When Truman fired MacArthur in April 1951, the country erupted. MacArthur returned home to enormous public admiration. He addressed Congress. He gave Americans a phrase they would remember even if they forgot the policy argument around it. Old soldiers never die. They just fade away. Truman looked small beside him in the public imagination, at least for a time. The general seemed grand, wronged, victorious in spirit even if dismissed in office. Truman seemed stubborn, political, and unsatisfying. Yet Truman's decision preserved civilian control over the military. That matters, and it should be said clearly. A democracy cannot allow generals to decide war policy because they dislike the limits set by elected leaders. But there is another layer here. Truman was defending civilian control over a war that had itself been entered by executive power. He was saying, in effect, that the president could commit troops without a declaration and then personally determine the boundaries within which generals must fight. Some of that was necessary. Some of it was constitutional in the commander-in-chief sense once forces were engaged. But the total package was extraordinary. The presidency had become the central engine of entry, limitation, escalation management, and public explanation. There is a lonely quality to that kind of power. Presidents are surrounded by advisors, but the decision finally narrows. Truman had to think about soldiers in Korea, civilians in Korea, Chinese forces, Soviet reactions, American politics, the United Nations, nuclear danger, congressional criticism, Allied confidence, and the authority of his office all at once. No human being can hold those things perfectly. That is one reason the constitutional design tried to distribute the burden. War is too large for one person's judgment, but the Cold War presidency moved in the other direction. It concentrated urgency in the Oval Office. Korea accelerated that concentration. It made the president not only the commander of forces, but the interpreter of global danger. If he saw a crisis as part of the communist advance, he could act. If he saw delay as weakness, he could move. If he saw escalation as dangerous, he could restrain. The entire world became a set of decisions awaiting presidential classification. The political rewards and punishments reinforced the pattern. Truman's popularity suffered during the war. The stalemate frustrated Americans. Casualties continued. Peace talks dragged. Republicans attacked him for weakness, incompetence, or losing control. Yet even criticism of Truman often accepted the basic premise that Korea mattered as a test of American resolve. The debate was less often over whether presidents should be able to wage such conflicts without declarations, and more over whether Truman was waging this one effectively. That distinction is crucial. Once the argument shifts from authority to performance, The authority has already been partly normalised. Future presidents would benefit from that shift. Critics would ask whether they were winning, whether they had enough troops, whether they were tough enough, whether they had an exit strategy. Those are important questions, but they can leave untouched the prior question of how the country entered the conflict in the first place. Eisenhower inherited this new reality. He campaigned in 1952 promising to go to Korea, and he did. His military stature gave him credibility Truman lacked. He wanted to end the war, and the armistice came in 1953. But Eisenhower did not dismantle the presidential power Korea had revealed. He used covert operations, nuclear threats, alliances, and military planning within the Cold War framework. He warned later about the military-industrial complex, but he also governed as a Cold War president inside the structures Korea had strengthened. This is how precedents survive changes in party. A Republican can criticize a Democrat's war and then inherit the tools that war normalized. A Democrat can criticize a Republican's intervention and later use similar arguments under different conditions. The office remembers what the office can do. Vietnam would show the full danger of this memory. Presidents Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon each inherited and expanded pieces of the commitment in Indochina. There was no single clean moment like a declared war. There were advisors, aid packages, commitments, theories, coups, incidents, resolutions, troop increases, bombing campaigns, and speeches. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution gave Johnson broad congressional authorization, but it was not a declaration of war in the old sense. The logic of Korea was present. Communist aggression must be resisted. Credibility matters. Presidents need flexibility. The conflict is limited. Escalation will signal resolve. Withdrawal will damage American standing. Vietnam was not Korea, but Korea had made Vietnam more thinkable. It had shown how a distant conflict could become a test of American credibility, and how presidents could move step by step until the country found itself in a war larger than the words initially used to describe it. This pattern did not end with the Cold War. Later presidents operated under different fears: terrorism, rogue states, humanitarian catastrophe, weapons of mass destruction, regional instability. The vocabulary changed, but the presidential habit remained. Korea helped create a model in which speed and global responsibility justified action before full national deliberation. Sometimes Congress authorized force, sometimes it was informed, sometimes it resisted, sometimes it went along. But the gravitational center had shifted toward the executive. The president had become the one expected to respond when the world broke open. That expectation can feel reassuring in a crisis. People want someone awake at the switch. But it also means that the Republic's decision to use force can become compressed into the judgment of a few people inside the executive branch, surrounded by intelligence briefings, military options, political fears, and the haunting question of what will happen if they do nothing. I want to be careful not to turn this into a simple accusation against Truman. He faced a real invasion. South Korea might have disappeared without outside help. The United Nations response had legitimacy. The fear of a wider pattern of aggression was understandable in 1950. Truman also resisted MacArthur's push toward a broader war, and that restraint may have prevented catastrophe. He was not a reckless man seeking glory. In some ways, he was the opposite. A president trying to prevent another world war while refusing to allow aggression to succeed. That is what makes his precedent so powerful and so difficult. The path to permanent war power was paved not only by ambition, but by caution. Not only by militarism, but by the desire to avoid worse outcomes. Not only by arrogance, but by responsibility under pressure. History becomes more useful when we admit that dangerous systems can be built by people trying to prevent danger. Still, the result remains. Korea taught presidents that they could fight without asking in the old way. It taught Congress that it could complain without fully reclaiming its authority. It taught the public that war might arrive under another name. It taught the military that limited war would be commanded politically from Washington, with goals that could shift and restrictions that could frustrate commanders. It taught allies that American presidents could move quickly. It taught enemies that American power could appear without the slow machinery of formal declaration. And it taught the American state that constitutional ambiguity could be survived. That may be the most important lesson of all. Once a government survives an ambiguity, it is more likely to use it again. There is an image I keep returning to when thinking about Truman in this story. Not Truman at a podium, not Truman signing a document, not Truman firing MacArthur. I picture him in a room late at night, the papers stacked, the maps open, the advisors gone or waiting nearby, and the weight of speed pressing against him. Somewhere in Korea, men are moving in darkness. Somewhere in Congress, arguments are forming. Somewhere in an American town, a family has not yet learned that its son is already part of history. The president has to decide before the country is fully understood. That is the modern presidency in its most troubling form. Awake before the republic, acting before the debate, carrying the burden and claiming the power at the same time. And once that power exists, the next temptation is escalation. If the president can enter a war quickly, can he widen it just as quickly? If commanders believe victory requires more force, who decides where the limit lies? If nuclear weapons exist but cannot be used without risking the unthinkable, do they still shape every conversation in the room? Korea forced America to confront those questions almost immediately. The war that began as a defense of South Korea soon brought American forces toward China's border, Chinese armies into the fight, MacArthur into open conflict with Truman, and nuclear options into the background of strategic thought. The habit of war had found its executive hand. Now it had to learn how close that hand could come to the fire without burning down the world. The frightening thing about escalation is that it almost never feels like madness at the moment it is being considered. It usually arrives dressed as logic. One more strike to protect the men already there. One more bombing campaign to slow the enemy. One more crossing of a line because stopping at the line now seems artificial. One more threat because a threat might end the killing faster than restraint. That was the trap Korea placed in front of the United States after the first months of the war. It began with a clear act of aggression, North Korean forces crossing into the south. It became a defensive operation to save South Korea from collapse. Then, after Incheon turned the war around, it became something larger, the possible destruction of the North Korean regime and the reunification of the peninsula under Seoul. Then Chinese forces entered, and suddenly the United States was fighting, not only to restore South Korea but to avoid humiliation, avoid retreat, avoid the appearance of weakness, and avoid a war so wide it might tear open the whole world. This is where the Korean War becomes one of the most important lessons in modern American power, because it showed that limited war is not naturally limited. It has to be held down, constantly, by people who are under pressure from commanders, newspapers, allies, enemies, grieving families, and their own fear that restraint will be mistaken for cowardice. The generals wanted tools, the politicians wanted control. The soldiers wanted survival. The public wanted victory, or at least an end that did not feel like defeat. And above all of it, silent but present in every serious room, was the bomb. Not one bomb now, not one secret weapon held only by the United States, but nuclear weapons in a world where the Soviet Union had already broken the American monopoly. The atomic age had changed war, but it had not ended it. Korea proved that armies could still fight, cities could still burn, men could still freeze in trenches and die on hills with numbers instead of names, all while the possibility of a nuclear war waited behind the ordinary war like a locked door everyone knew was there. This is what made escalation so terrifying and so strangely comforting. Every step upward promised to solve the immediate problem. Bomb the bridges, and the enemy slows down. Strike the bases and the pressure eases. Use more firepower and fewer American soldiers die. Threaten something larger and perhaps the other side backs away. It all makes sense when you look only at the next step. The danger is that war does not ask you to look only at the next step. It asks what the next step makes possible after that. When General Douglas MacArthur looked north after Incheon, he saw an opportunity. He had taken a war that seemed nearly lost and reversed it with a landing many people had considered too risky. He had earned immense prestige, and prestige in war is not a small thing. It changes how people hear you. A cautious general after a failure sounds timid. A bold general after a triumph sounds like a prophet. MacArthur believed the North Korean army could be destroyed. He believed the war could be finished by Christmas. He believed that stopping at the 38th parallel made little sense if the enemy was collapsing beyond it. Many people in Washington agreed, or at least allowed the logic to carry them. The original goal had been to repel the invasion, but success expanded the imagination. Once the enemy is running, limited aims begin to feel like wasted sacrifice. Why leave the source of the invasion intact? Why ask dead Americans to have died only to restore the line that had failed in the first place? Why not finish it? These questions had emotional force. They still do in almost every war. The trouble was that the map did not end where American confidence ended. Beyond North Korea stood China, newly communist, deeply suspicious, still wounded from invasion, civil war, occupation, and revolution. Chinese leaders had warned that they would not tolerate hostile forces moving to the Yalu River, their border with Korea. Those warnings were heard in Washington and in MacArthur's command, but they were weighed against the momentum of victory. Warnings from an enemy often sound like bluff until the enemy proves otherwise. By the time Chinese forces struck in large numbers in late 1950, the United Nations advance had gone too far to pretend that the war was still the same war it had been in June. American and Allied troops who had thought they were moving toward the end of the conflict found themselves caught in a new one. The retreat from the north, especially the ordeal around the Chosin Reservoir, became one of the defining experiences of the war. Men fought in bitter cold, weapons malfunctioned, vehicles froze, wounds froze, and the landscape itself became an enemy. The idea that the war might be over by Christmas turned into a winter of survival. That is the first lesson of escalation in Korea. A successful move can create the confidence that makes the next move too easy. Incheon was brilliant, but brilliance is dangerous when it convinces leaders that the war will continue obeying the same logic. MacArthur's confidence did not disappear after China entered. If anything, he became more determined that the war had to be widened. From his point of view, asking his forces to fight Chinese armies inside Korea while leaving Chinese bases, bridges, and supply routes across the border untouched was militarily absurd. He believed there was no substitute for victory, and to him victory required striking the enemy's ability to wage war. That meant expanding the conflict beyond Korea. He wanted more freedom to attack targets in Manchuria. He considered the use of nationalist Chinese forces from Taiwan. He believed the restrictions placed on him by Washington were preventing success and prolonging the suffering of the men under his command. It is important to understand this as more than ego, though ego was certainly involved. From a field commander's perspective, limits can look like betrayal. You are told to win, but not to hit certain targets. You're told to protect your troops, but not to use all available means. You are told the cause is vital, but not vital enough to risk a wider war. Every limited war creates this bitterness. The general sees the battlefield. The president sees the world beyond the battlefield. Both can be right about what they see, and still collide because they are not looking at the same horizon. Truman's horizon included Moscow. It included Europe. It included nuclear weapons. It included the possibility that a direct expanded war with China could trigger Soviet involvement, and that Soviet involvement could trigger something far worse than Korea. For MacArthur, the immediate enemy was Chinese power in Korea. For Truman, the immediate enemy was also escalation itself. This is why their conflict became so explosive. It was not only a disagreement between two men, It was a disagreement over what war had become in the nuclear age. Could a general still pursue victory in the old way, striking wherever the enemy's war-making power could be found? Or did the existence of nuclear weapons and superpower alliances mean that victory itself had to be redefined, narrowed, and sometimes denied to prevent a greater catastrophe? Truman chose the second answer. MacArthur never accepted it. The bombs made that argument darker. The United States had used atomic weapons against Japan only 5 years earlier. The memory was fresh, and the moral meaning was still unsettled, though many Americans at the time defended the decision as necessary to end World War II. By Korea, atomic weapons were not an unthinkable abstraction. They were weapons that had already been used in war. That fact mattered. When military and political leaders discussed possible nuclear use during the Korean conflict, they were not discussing science fiction. They were discussing an existing tool, one that some believed might compensate for manpower shortages, break enemy concentrations, or force negotiations. Truman publicly stated at one point that every weapon was under consideration, a statement that caused alarm because everyone knew what weapon sat at the end of that sentence. Officials later tried to clarify and control the meaning, but the fear had already surfaced. The bomb had entered the conversation not only as a last resort in total war, but as a possible instrument within a limited war. That is a terrifying shift. Once nuclear weapons become part of ordinary military planning, even at the edge of it, the boundary between conventional conflict and catastrophe becomes less solid. Some military planners examined scenarios involving atomic strikes against Chinese targets, troop concentrations, or supply lines. There were also practical problems. Korea's terrain, the movement of Chinese forces, the proximity of allies and civilians, the risk of Soviet response, and the political consequences all made nuclear use far more complicated than the simple phrase "use the bomb" suggested. Nuclear weapons are sometimes imagined as a shortcut, a single overwhelming act that ends a problem. In reality, they create new problems the moment they are considered. What target? How many? What if the enemy does not surrender? What if the Soviet Union responds elsewhere? What if allies recoil? What if nuclear use becomes normalized? What if the war expands instead of ends? These questions weighed heavily on Truman and his advisors. The fact that nuclear weapons were not used in Korea should not make us forget how close they came to being part of the serious discussion. Restraint was a decision, not an accident. The ordinary way this story is sometimes told makes Truman the cautious civilian and MacArthur the reckless general, and there is truth in that version, but it is too neat. The Joint Chiefs of Staff also worried about the larger war. Omar Bradley famously argued against expanding the conflict into China, calling it the wrong war, in the wrong place, at the wrong time, and with the wrong enemy. That line endured because it captured something many officials feared. The United States had to avoid letting Korea consume the larger strategy of containing the Soviet Union. Europe still mattered most to many planners. If America poured itself into a massive Asian land war with China, what would happen if the Soviet Union moved in Europe? What if the United States exhausted itself in the wrong theatre? This was not softness. It was strategic discipline. But discipline is hard to sell to a public that hears its soldiers are dying and its generals are being restrained. The appeal of escalation is that it sounds like action. Restraint sounds like patience, and patience sounds weak when casualty lists are growing. MacArthur understood that. He spoke in the language of victory, honour and military necessity. Truman spoke in the language of limits, coalition management, and preventing World War III. One language stirred crowds more easily than the other. When Truman fired MacArthur in April 1951, the issue of escalation came into the open with a force almost no domestic argument could contain. Millions of Americans admired MacArthur. He returned home to parades and applause. His address to Congress became a national event. Truman's decision looked to many people like the humiliation of a great soldier by a small politician. But the constitutional principle was clear. Generals do not choose the nation's wars. Still, beneath that principle was the unresolved frustration of limited war. If the United States was powerful enough to devastate enemies, why accept stalemate? If America had atomic weapons, why fight hill by hill? If communism was a global danger, why treat China as untouchable beyond the Korean border? These questions did not vanish with MacArthur's dismissal. They remained inside American military thinking, inside public impatience, and inside later wars. Korea taught Americans that having overwhelming power does not mean being able to use it safely. That is a hard lesson for a powerful country to absorb. Power creates the expectation of control. If you can build the planes, launch the ships, move the armies, and split the atom, surely you can shape the outcome. Korea said no, not always. You can dominate the skies and still not get political victory. You can bomb supply lines and still watch soldiers come through mountain paths at night. You can possess nuclear weapons and still decide that using them would be a disaster. You can win battles and still end up negotiating over a line on a map. This is why escalation becomes comforting. It offers an escape from the humiliation of limits. If the current level of force has not produced success, then perhaps the next level will. More bombing, more troops, more targets, more pressure. More threats. The logic is simple and almost narcotic. It promises that the problem is not the war itself, not the assumptions behind it, not the political objective, but merely insufficient force. America would return to that promise again and again. In Vietnam, the bombing of North Vietnam would be justified as pressure that might change behaviour, signal resolve, and protect American credibility. In later wars, surge strategies, expanded target lists, shock campaigns, drone strikes, and special operations would carry their own versions of the same belief. Escalation is seductive because it allows leaders to avoid saying the objective may not be achievable at an acceptable cost. It says, instead, we have not yet applied the right kind of pressure. Korea gave the United States an early experience of both the temptation and the danger. Air power is central here because it offered the cleanest illusion. From the air, war can appear more manageable than it is on the ground. Targets can be photographed, selected, struck, assessed. Bridges, rail yards, supply depots, factories, troop concentrations and roads become points in a system. Destroy enough points and the system should fail. That is the theory, and sometimes it works in specific ways. Air power did damage North Korean and Chinese logistics. It made movement costly. It destroyed infrastructure across North Korea. But it did not produce surrender. It did not remove the need for infantry to hold ground. It did not solve the political problem of China's willingness to absorb losses or North Korea's willingness to endure devastation. The bombing of North Korea was severe, and its consequences for Korean civilians were immense. Cities were wrecked. Dams and industrial targets were attacked. The war from the air contributed to the deep memory of destruction in North Korea, a memory that later became part of the regime's own story of siege and survival. For Americans, air power often remained a way to imagine fighting with fewer American casualties. For those beneath it, it was not limited at all. The idea of limited war depends very much on where you are standing. From Washington, Korea was limited because it did not become World War III. From a village under bombardment, that distinction would have felt almost meaningless. Escalation also had a bureaucratic comfort. It gave every institution something to do. The Air Force could propose expanded bombing. The Army could request more divisions. The Navy could tighten blockades and shell coastlines. Intelligence agencies could identify targets and threats. Diplomats could use military pressure as leverage. Presidents could show resolve without immediately admitting failure. Congress could fund strength. Contractors could build what strength required. Each step upward activated the machinery described earlier, the machinery Korea helped strengthen. This is how military habits and escalation habits feed each other. A country with many tools will search for the tool that promises progress. When progress does not come, the answer often becomes a larger tool. By 1952 and 1953, as the war settled into brutal stalemate, the question of pressure became even more intense. Negotiations dragged on, especially over prisoners of war. Fighting continued over hills and outposts that seemed small on a map but deadly to the men ordered to take or hold them. Eisenhower campaigned on ending the war and then visited Korea before taking office. His administration later allowed hints, threats, and preparations to suggest that the United States might widen the war or use more severe means if negotiations failed, though historians have debated exactly how decisive those nuclear signals were in bringing about the armistice. What matters for this story is that nuclear threat had become part of the bargaining atmosphere. Even when not used, the bomb shaped the room. It could be gestured toward. It could be left on the table without being picked up. It could make the enemy wonder how far America might go. That too became a Cold War habit. Nuclear weapons as background pressure. The ultimate escalation held in reserve. Terrifying precisely because they might be unnecessary until the day someone decided they were not. The armistice finally came in July 1953, but the escalation question did not end. Korea left behind a lesson that was both useful and dangerous. The useful lesson was that civilian leaders must control generals, and that limiting a war can prevent catastrophe. Truman's refusal to widen the conflict into China may have spared the world a much larger war. The dangerous lesson was that limited war could be managed, sustained, adjusted, and used as an instrument of policy under the nuclear shadow. If Korea had ended in immediate disaster, perhaps Americans would have rejected the model. If it had escalated into World War III, the lesson would have been obvious in the worst possible way. Instead, Korea ended in a grey zone. The United States did not get total victory, but it did preserve South Korea. It did not use nuclear weapons, but it learned to consider and threaten them. It did not let MacArthur widen the war, but it continued fighting for 2 more years after he was gone. It did not lose in the old sense, but it did not win in the old sense either. That grey outcome made the model reusable. Limited war under nuclear conditions was frustrating, but survivable. Escalation could be considered, debated, partially applied, and restrained. The machinery could absorb the strain. This may be the most unsettling part of the Korean War's legacy. The United States learned that it could approach the edge without falling over it. That sounds like wisdom, and sometimes it is. But it can also encourage future leaders to approach the edge again, believing they too will know when to stop. Every later crisis carries this inheritance. The president and the generals sit with maps and options. Someone argues that force must be increased. Someone warns of wider consequences. Someone says credibility is at stake. Someone says the enemy only understands strength. Someone asks what happens if nothing is done. The available tools seem precise. The risks seem manageable. The last war is remembered just enough to justify action, but not enough to prevent confidence. Korea was where America practiced this conversation in its modern form. It was where the bomb entered limited war planning without being used. It was where a famous general demanded expansion and a president chose restraint. It was where air power promised more than it could deliver. It was where victory became too dangerous to pursue completely and defeat became too costly to accept openly. It was where escalation became both temptation and therapy, a way to soothe the fear that the war was not going the way it was supposed to go. And once a country learns that feeling, once it learns that more force can always be imagined as the answer just beyond the current failure, it becomes very hard to give up. The guns would eventually settle into an armistice line, the negotiators would sit across tables, and the war would become fixed in place rather than resolved. That result was not the victory Americans had been trained to expect from World War II. It was something colder, less satisfying, and far more influential. A stalemate that could be described as success because the enemy had not conquered the South. From that point forward, America would have to learn how to call not losing a kind of winning. That phrase sounds small at first, almost like a consolation prize handed to a tired country that had run out of better words. Not losing, it does not stir a crowd. It does not fit easily on a monument. It does not give a president the kind of sentence that school children memorize later. World War II had ended with surrender documents, occupied capitals, flags raised, prisoners liberated, enemies disarmed, and a moral clarity that Americans could carry home with them. Korea offered something very different. It offered a line on a map that had moved, bled, burned, and then settled close to where it began. It offered negotiations so slow and bitter that men died by the thousands while diplomats argued over prisoners, boundaries, and face-saving language. It offered no peace treaty, no unified Korea, no collapse of communism in the north, no final handshake that made the war feel complete. And yet, by the end, the United States learned to describe that result as victory, or at least as something close enough to victory to defend. South Korea had not been conquered. The United States had not been driven from the peninsula. Communist expansion had been stopped at a terrible cost. The line held. That was the new achievement. Not Berlin in ruins, not Tokyo Bay, not unconditional surrender. A line held. This was a major change in the American understanding of war. Americans were not unfamiliar with messy endings before Korea, but the national memory after 1945 had been shaped by total victory. The Second World War had trained people to expect that a war worth fighting should end with the enemy clearly defeated. It had trained them to believe that sacrifice led somewhere visible. You could point to it. Nazi Germany no longer ruled Europe. Imperial Japan no longer ruled its empire. The men came home, the factories changed over, the parades happened, and even though grief remained in every town, the public story had a beginning, middle, and end. Korea did not fit that pattern. Korea began as an emergency, expanded into an offensive, collapsed into a retreat, hardened into a grinding struggle, and ended with an armistice that did not actually end the war in a legal or emotional sense. It stopped the shooting. It did not resolve the conflict. And that difference mattered because America had to learn how to live with an unfinished war as a permanent fact. By 1951, after the Chinese intervention and the stabilization of the front, the Korean War had become a war of hills, patrols, artillery, bunkers, raids, and negotiations. The dramatic movements of the first year gave way to something slower and in some ways more difficult to explain. The front lines shifted, but not enough to make the newspaper maps feel decisive. Men fought over terrain that often seemed meaningless to civilians back home. A ridge might be taken at great cost, lost, retaken, abandoned, or renamed in memory of the men who died there. Places like Heartbreak Ridge, Bloody Ridge, Porkchop Hill, and Old Baldy entered the vocabulary of the war not because they promised victory in the grand sense, but because they represented the price of holding pressure, bargaining position, and honour in a conflict where the large political result had already narrowed. The United States was no longer marching north to reunify Korea. It was no longer simply scrambling to prevent collapse. It was fighting to hold enough ground, inflict enough cost, and maintain enough credibility to negotiate from strength. That is a very different kind of war, and it is much harder to make people understand why their sons are still dying in it. Imagine an American family in 1952 trying to follow the war through newspapers, radio, and the early glow of television. The first shock is gone. The Great MacArthur drama has passed. The front no longer sweeps up and down the peninsula in a way that creates obvious headlines. Instead, the reports become repetitive. Patrol clashes, airstrikes, casualties, talks resumed, talks stalled, prisoner dispute continues, hill taken, hill lost, weather bad, morale strained. The war becomes background noise, but for the families with men in Korea, it is not background at all. It is the whole room. A mother sees the word Korea and stops reading everything else. A wife waits for a letter. A father who fought in World War II tries to understand why this war does not seem to move toward anything. The country is told the fight matters, but the visible evidence of progress becomes harder to find. This is one of the emotional conditions that made stalemate so important. The government had to persuade people that endurance itself had meaning. The negotiations at Panmunjom became part of that endurance. They began in 1951 and dragged on for 2 years. 2 years of talks while the war continued. That is a detail worth sitting with because it shows how strange limited war had become. Men were being killed in a war that both sides were already trying in some form to stop. The talks were not simple because the issues were not simple. Where exactly would the line be? How would the demilitarized zone work? What would happen to prisoners of war, especially those who did not want to be returned to communist control? How could each side stop fighting without appearing to admit defeat? The prisoner issue became especially bitter. The United States and its allies argued against forced repatriation of prisoners who refused to return. Communist negotiators saw this as propaganda and a challenge to their legitimacy. The talks stalled again and again. While they stalled, commanders ordered attacks that were partly military and partly political, attempts to improve positions before an agreement or pressure the other side at the table. This is the grim logic of negotiation under fire. A hill becomes a sentence in a diplomatic argument. A patrol becomes punctuation. Artillery becomes emphasis. For the soldiers, none of that made the mud warmer or the fear smaller. The last phase of the Korean War could feel especially cruel because the possibility of an armistice was always near enough to imagine and too far away to trust. If you were a soldier in 1953, you might know that talks were underway. You might know that everyone was tired. You might know, in some vague way, that the war could end soon. But soon is a dangerous word in combat. Soon does not stop a shell. Soon does not keep a patrol from walking into fire. Soon does not comfort the man who is killed 1 week before the agreement is signed. The final months of a war can be among the hardest to understand because every death seems to ask whether it had to happen. Korea had thousands of those deaths. The war was moving toward a line, and men were still dying to shape the exact position of that line. Dwight Eisenhower entered this story as a man who knew the weight of command and the political value of restraint. During the 1952 campaign, he promised that he would go to Korea. The phrase was simple, direct, and effective. It suggested action without promising a miracle. Eisenhower had a kind of credibility Truman lacked by then. He had led Allied forces in Europe. He understood military operations not as an abstraction, but as a daily burden of logistics, personalities, weather, timing, and death. When he became president, he wanted the war ended, but he also did not want the ending to look like weakness. This is the problem every president inherits in a stalemated war. Ending it is necessary, but ending it badly can be politically fatal. You must stop the bleeding while convincing the country that the blood already spent was not wasted. You must negotiate without seeming to beg. You must compromise while using the language of firmness. Eisenhower was better suited to this than Truman because his reputation protected him. A general who had defeated Hitler could accept an armistice in Korea with less risk of being called soft, though even he had to handle the politics carefully. The armistice signed in July 1953 did not give everyone what they wanted. Syngman Rhee, the president of South Korea, opposed any settlement that left Korea divided. That is understandable from his perspective, even if his own rule was authoritarian and deeply flawed. To Rhee, an armistice near the old line meant accepting the survival of the North Korean regime and the continued division of the nation. He wanted reunification. Many Koreans, north and south, had not experienced the division as a natural permanent condition. It had been imposed after Japanese defeat and then hardened by war. For Korean families separated by the line, the armistice was not a solution. It was a wall. For the United States, however, the objective had narrowed. The survival of South Korea was enough. Not emotionally enough for everyone, not morally enough for those who dreamed of a unified free Korea, but strategically enough. This is how stalemate became victory. The definition changed until the available outcome could fit inside it. That adjustment required a new kind of honesty. though the honesty was often buried under speeches. The United States had to accept that it could not always turn battlefield power into total political success. It could preserve, deter, punish, and contain, but it could not always remake the map according to its preferred outcome without risking a larger disaster. Korea taught this in hard terms. American power was enormous, but not unlimited. China's intervention had shown that other nations would absorb staggering costs to prevent outcomes they considered intolerable. Nuclear weapons existed, but using them could break the world open. Air power could devastate, but not automatically decide. Ground forces could hold, but not conquer without consequences. The Soviet Union watched from behind the curtain of the war, and every decision had to be weighed against what might happen elsewhere. Victory was no longer simply what America wanted. Victory was what could be achieved without triggering something worse. This is where the phrase limited war becomes almost painfully important. A limited war requires limited victory. That sounds obvious, but it was not emotionally easy for Americans who had just come out of a war of unconditional surrender. Limited war means you may fight fiercely and still stop short. It means you may lose men for an objective that sounds modest. It means the enemy may remain in power when the guns stop. It means the public may ask with real anguish what the fighting was for. In Korea, the answer became, South Korea survived. That answer was not nothing. It was a real outcome. If the United States and its allies had not intervened, South Korea likely would have been absorbed by the North in 1950. Millions of people would have lived under a different regime. The later history of South Korea, including its economic transformation and eventual democratization, would not have unfolded as it did. So the achievement matters. But the cost and the incompleteness also matter. A truthful memory has to hold both. The American habit that emerged from Korea was the ability to call preservation victory. This would shape later conflicts in complicated ways. In some cases, preserving an ally or preventing conquest can be a legitimate and achievable aim. In other cases, the language of preservation can keep a country fighting long after the original goal has become confused. Korea made it possible to say that a war did not have to end with the enemy's surrender to have been worth fighting. Again, this was not entirely wrong. The danger was that this lesson could be stretched. If not losing is victory, how long do you keep fighting to avoid looking as though you lost? If credibility depends on holding, when is withdrawal allowed? If stalemate can be defended as success, what stops leaders from entering wars where stalemate is the best they can reasonably expect? These questions would return in Vietnam with terrible force. They would return whenever American leaders found themselves trying to explain why a conflict with unclear progress still had to continue. Korea also changed the politics of casualties. In World War II, casualties were enormous, but they were placed inside a story of total national mobilization and clear enemy defeat. In Korea, casualties mounted inside a more ambiguous story. This made every loss harder to explain. The government could not say that Berlin was about to fall or Tokyo was about to surrender. It could say that the line must be held, that aggression must be stopped, that negotiations required strength. These arguments were not empty, but they were less satisfying. They required trust in strategy rather than visible evidence of victory. Modern American war would often ask the public for this kind of trust. Trust us, the pressure is working. Trust us, the enemy understands resolve. Trust us, leaving now would make the sacrifices meaningless. Trust us, the mission is succeeding in ways that may not be obvious. Korea was one of the first major wars where that kind of language became central. There is an especially difficult moral problem here. Once people have died for a mission, leaders attempted to continue partly because people have died. This is often described as honouring sacrifice, and it can come from a sincere place. No president wants to tell families that their sons died for a goal that cannot be achieved. No general wants to admit that a position was not worth the cost. No country wants to look backward and see waste. So the dead become an argument for continuing. We must not let them have died in vain. Those words sound noble, and sometimes they express real duty. But they can also trap the living. If the only way to redeem past deaths is to risk more deaths, then the war begins feeding on memory. Korea did not create this problem, but its stalemate sharpened it. The longer negotiations dragged, the more each new casualty added weight to the demand that the final settlement must mean something. When the final settlement was an armistice near the original line, the meaning had to be found in the prevention of defeat. The demilitarized zone became the physical form of that meaning. It is strange to call it demilitarized when it became one of the most militarized boundaries on Earth, but the name stayed. A strip of land across the peninsula separating two heavily armed states, watched by soldiers, shaped by mines, fences, guard posts, and decades of suspicion. The DMZ made stalemate visible. It turned the unfinished war into geography. For Americans, it became one more frontier of containment, a place where troops remained long after the main fighting ended. For Koreans, it became a wound across families, roads, fields, memory, and national identity. The armistice froze the conflict, but freezing is not healing. A frozen thing can remain dangerous for a very long time. This frozen outcome became useful to American strategy. It showed that a permanent military presence could stabilize a region, or at least prevent renewed invasion. It showed that alliances backed by troops could last beyond the active fighting. It showed that a war could transition into a long-term security commitment without requiring the public to feel as though the war continued every day. This was very important for the emerging American global posture. Troops stationed in South Korea after the armistice were not seen as the same thing as troops fighting in the war, even though their presence was part of the war's unfinished structure. The United States had found a way to convert combat into containment, and containment into garrison duty. The emergency became a deployment. The deployment became normal. South Korea's later success gave this arrangement a powerful retroactive defence. Looking back from the late 20th and early 21st centuries, many Americans could say that Korea proved the value of American commitment. South Korea survived, industrialized, and after long internal struggle became democratic. North Korea became isolated, militarized, repressive, and impoverished by comparison. This contrast made the Korean War appear, over time, more successful than it felt in 1953. That is fair in one sense. Historical outcomes take time. Some victories are not visible at the armistice table, but retroactive success can also simplify memory. It can make the war seem cleaner than it was. It can hide the devastation endured by Korean civilians, the authoritarianism of early South Korea, the brutality on all sides, the frustration of the soldiers, and the dangerous precedents created in Washington. A later good outcome does not erase the cost of the path taken to reach it. For the United States, the most transferable lesson was not South Korea's eventual democracy. That depended on Korean people, Korean labour, Korean protest, Korean politics, Korean students, Korean workers, Korean risks, and Korean choices over decades. The more immediately transferable American lesson was that an unresolved war could still be politically survivable if it was framed as containment. This mattered enormously. It meant a president did not necessarily need total victory. He needed an argument that the enemy had been stopped, that credibility had been preserved, that allies had been reassured, and that the cost of continuing had become greater than the benefit of pushing for more. In Korea, that argument worked just enough. It did not make Truman popular. It did not make the war beloved. It did not create national celebration. But it allowed the United States to move forward without admitting defeat. This grey success changed expectations inside the national security state. Planners could now imagine future conflicts where the goal was not to conquer an enemy capital, but to prevent a hostile takeover, preserve a friendly regime, deny territory, or maintain a balance. The map of victory became defensive. Stop the spread, hold the line, keep the ally alive, prevent collapse. These are not small goals, but they are open to long timelines and uncertain measures. How do you know when collapse has truly been prevented? How long must you stay to keep the ally alive? What if the ally is corrupt or authoritarian? What if the enemy does not need to win quickly, only to wait longer than the United States is willing to stay? Korea provided one answer: stay, fight, negotiate, freeze the conflict, and maintain a long-term presence. In Korea, that answer endured. Elsewhere, it would prove much harder. Vietnam exposed the weakness of applying the Korean lesson too broadly. American officials feared another communist victory in Asia. They worried about credibility. They imagined lines that had to be held. But Vietnam was not Korea. The geography, politics, colonial history, nationalist energy, military balance, and legitimacy of the local government were different. There was no equivalent of the North Korean conventional invasion across a recognised dividing line in June 1950, at least not at the beginning of America's deepening involvement. There was a revolutionary and anti-colonial struggle intertwined with Cold War communism. Yet the Korean template encouraged officials to think in terms of containment, credibility, and preventing loss. The idea that stalemate might be bearable in Korea did not mean it would be bearable everywhere. But habits do not ask whether the next case is truly similar. They reach for the familiar pattern. Another effect of Korea was that it made the public more tolerant, for a time, of unclear endings. Not enthusiastic, but tolerant. Americans did not celebrate the Korean armistice the way they celebrated VJ Day. There were no comparable scenes of national release. The war receded instead of concluding. That became a recognisable modern experience. A war might not end with a parade. It might end with a press conference, an agreement, a withdrawal schedule, a ceasefire, or simply a gradual lowering of attention. The public might move on before the historical consequences are clear. This is one way democracies live with distant war. Attention fades. The war becomes a veteran's memory, a family's grief, a line in a textbook, a foreign policy precedent. Korea became known as the Forgotten War partly because its ending did not demand remembrance. It did not give Americans a single emotional scene around which to build memory. It gave them an armistice and a continuing border. But forgetting did not mean the war had no effect. In fact, forgetting may have made its lessons more powerful because they entered policy without being fully debated in public memory. World War II was remembered loudly, so its lessons were argued over, mythologized, celebrated, and taught. Vietnam was remembered painfully, so its lessons became part of national argument. Korea, quieter in memory, became more available as a practical precedent. Presidents and planners could absorb its habits without the public constantly re-examining them. Limited war, undeclared war, permanent readiness. Military containment, stalemate as success. These became tools in the kit. The fact that fewer Americans thought deeply about Korea made it easier for the tools to remain. There is a personal way to understand the change. Imagine a man who fought in Korea returning home in 1953. He does not return to a country transformed by victory parades. He returns to a country already moving on. The suburbs are growing. The economy is changing. Children are watching television. Politicians are talking about communism, taxes, schools, highways, and atomic danger. He may be thanked, or he may simply be expected to become quiet and resume life. What does he say when someone asks whether they won? He might pause. He might say, "We stopped them." That answer is true. It is also heavy. It does not contain the satisfaction of conquest. It contains endurance, loss, and a line held under conditions most people will never understand. That answer became America's new kind of victory. And once a country learns to accept that answer, it changes the way leaders can speak. They can promise not triumph, but prevention. Not peace, but stability. Not victory, but no worse outcome. This may sound mature, and sometimes it is. A nuclear world may require modest aims, Not every war can or should end in unconditional surrender. Sometimes preventing conquest is enough. Sometimes restraint is wiser than glory. Korea deserves credit for teaching that. But the same lesson can become dangerous when it lowers the standard for entering conflict. If the goal is only to prevent something worse, almost any intervention can be defended. If victory means avoiding a bad outcome, then the mission can be extended whenever a worse outcome is imaginable. And in foreign policy, a worse outcome is always imaginable. By the end of the Korean War, America had learned to live inside contradiction. It had fought a war without declaring one. It had resisted aggression without defeating the aggressor completely. It had threatened escalation while choosing restraint. It had suffered heavy casualties for a result that looked, on a map, almost static. It had preserved South Korea but accepted national division. It had ended active combat but maintained permanent military presence. It had not won in the old way, but it had not lost. That became enough. Not emotionally enough, not for every family, not for every soldier, not for every Korean whose life was broken by the war, but enough for the American state to defend the outcome and continue the mission. The lesson settled into the bloodstream of policy. Hold the line, preserve credibility, accept limited gains, avoid wider war, keep forces ready, maintain alliances, define success as preventing defeat. These ideas were not all foolish. Some were necessary in the world America faced, but together they formed a pattern that made future wars easier to begin and harder to finish. Because once stalemate can be called victory, leaders may become less afraid of entering conflicts where decisive victory is unlikely. They may tell themselves that success does not require a clean ending. They may believe that American power can manage the grey zone indefinitely. Korea showed that sometimes it can. It also hid how costly that management can become. The armistice line held, but it did more than separate North and South Korea. It marked a boundary in American history. On one side was the older expectation that wars should end with clear victory or clear defeat. On the other side was the modern age of limited objectives, permanent deployments, frozen conflicts, negotiated pauses and military commitments that outlive the presidents who begin them. The Korean War did not feel like the future to many Americans at the time. It felt like a frustrating, cold, distant conflict that refused to become either glorious or finished. But that was exactly why it mattered. It taught America how to fight without resolution, how to stop without peace, how to claim success without triumph, and how to leave soldiers in place after the headlines faded. And after the headlines faded, the habit remained. The war ended on paper only in the narrowest sense. The armistice stopped the main fighting, but the American military presence stayed, the Cold War logic stayed, the presidential precedent stayed, the defense budget stayed, the fear of credibility loss stayed, and the idea that America must be ready for the next test stayed. Korea became less a memory than a structure. It stood behind later choices, sometimes openly, often quietly, shaping what presidents thought they had to do and what citizens had learned to accept. The final part of the story is not only about Korea after 1953, it is about the way that unfinished war remained inside American power long after most Americans stopped naming it. The armistice did not sound like victory. It did not sound like defeat either. That was the problem. It sounded like pencils moving across paper, chairs scraping against floors, interpreters working through careful sentences, commanders signing their names to an agreement that stopped the shooting without settling the war. No capital fell. No enemy government surrendered. No parade rolled through Washington with the emotional force of 1945. There was no sailor kissing a nurse in Times Square. No single photograph that could carry the meaning of the whole thing. There was a line, a buffer zone, a promise to stop firing, and thousands of families on every side trying to understand why the end felt so little like an ending. The Korean War had begun with sudden movement, armies rushing south, cities falling, civilians fleeing, American troops arriving in haste. It ended in stillness, or something close to stillness, with soldiers staring across a divided peninsula at other soldiers doing the same. That stillness became the new fact. The war ended on paper, but it stayed in the habits, budgets, fears and reflexes of the United States for the rest of the century and beyond. This is one of the hardest things to explain about Korea, because the war disappeared from American memory faster than it disappeared from American life. The guns quieted in 1953, but the structure remained. American troops stayed in South Korea. The demilitarized zone became a permanent edge of American strategy. Military planners continued to prepare for the possibility that the war could restart. Presidents inherited the commitment as if it were part of the furniture of the office. Congress funded it. Generals planned around it. Young Americans were stationed there long after the men who had fought the original war had grown old. For most citizens at home, Korea became a name in textbooks, a MASH setting, a half-remembered war between the Good War and the war that tore the country apart in Vietnam. But for the American state, Korea never became distant in the same way. It remained a live wire. It was not only remembered, it was maintained. Think about the phrase armistice for a moment. It is not peace. It is not reconciliation. It is not a settlement in the deep sense. It is an agreement to stop fighting. That distinction matters because it meant the Korean War did not become a closed event. It became a managed condition. The United States learned to live with an unresolved military commitment as a normal part of national security. That was a huge shift. A war could now stop without being over. A battlefield could become a border. An emergency could become a deployment. A deployment could become a tradition. Children could be born, grow up, join the military and be sent to guard a line created before their parents were born. That is how unfinished wars become part of a country's bloodstream. They stop appearing as decisions and start appearing as background. The Korean peninsula made this background visible. On one side stood South Korea, battered, poor, authoritarian for many years, but alive. On the other stood North Korea, devastated by bombing, hardened by siege, ruled by a regime that turned memory of the war into one of the foundations of its identity. Between them lay the DMZ, a strip of land that seemed to announce the absurdity of its own name. Demilitarized, yet watched by armies. Quiet, yet dangerous. Empty in some places, yet crowded with history. The land itself became a reminder that containment had not solved the conflict. It had frozen it. And freezing something can preserve it for a very long time. For American leaders, the frozen war in Korea became proof of several things at once. It proved, they believed, that American commitment could save an ally. It proved that communist expansion could be stopped by force. It proved that troops stationed abroad could deter another attack. It proved that a limited war did not have to become a world war if managed carefully. These were not imaginary lessons. South Korea did survive. A wider war was avoided. The line held. But the same facts also taught more dangerous lessons. They taught that an undeclared war could be fought and politically survived. They taught that permanent overseas deployments could become normal. They taught that military force could preserve a difficult status quo even when it could not produce a clean peace. They taught that the American public could gradually stop paying attention while the commitment continued. In Korea, those lessons formed under pressure. Later, they would be used with more confidence and less humility. This is why the war stayed in America's blood. Not because Americans talked about it constantly. They did not. Not because every later war was a simple copy of Korea. None of them were. Vietnam was not Korea. Iraq was not Korea. Afghanistan was not Korea. But Korea changed the reflexes of the body. It taught the American state how to tense its muscles before the public had fully understood the threat. It taught presidents how to move forces quickly. It taught Congress how to argue while still funding. It taught military planners how to prepare for limited wars under global danger. It taught defense industries that the end of one war did not mean the end of demand. It taught citizens that war could exist somewhere far away without transforming every living room at home. It taught the country that the line between wartime and peacetime could remain blurred for years, and then decades. Vietnam is the place where the Korean inheritance became most painful. In the years after the armistice, American officials looked at Asia through eyes Korea had trained. They feared another communist advance. They feared another collapse that would signal weakness. They feared that allies would doubt American promises if one country fell. They feared that enemies would read restraint as invitation. The word credibility came back again and again, as if the entire world were watching not only what America did, but what America allowed. In Korea, credibility had been tied to the survival of South Korea after a conventional invasion. In Vietnam, the situation was different, more tangled with colonial history, nationalism, guerrilla war, and the weakness of the government Washington supported. But habits are powerful because they make difference look smaller than it is. Once leaders believed that losing one place could unravel confidence everywhere, the pressure to stay became enormous. The tragedy of Vietnam was not caused by Korea alone, but Korea helped make the escalation feel familiar. Advisors could be sent, aid could be increased, air power could be applied, the conflict could be described as limited. The president could insist that withdrawal would damage American standing. Congress could authorize broad action without declaring war. Each step could be defended as necessary to prevent something worse. The Korean War had shown that difficult, limited conflict could preserve an ally and produce an outcome later described as success. But Vietnam exposed the danger of borrowing that lesson without understanding the local reality. A country can learn from the last war and still be misled by it. Sometimes the lesson that saved one situation becomes the assumption that ruins the next. There is a deeper pattern here, and it reaches beyond Vietnam. Korea helped establish a way of thinking in which America's military power was not only a shield against direct attack, but a tool for managing world order. That phrase sounds calm and responsible, but it carries enormous weight. Managing world order means deciding which governments must be supported, which threats must be contained, which borders matter, which revolutions are unacceptable, which allies must be reassured, and which enemies must be punished. It turns the whole world into a field of possible obligations. A crisis in one country becomes a message to another. A small war becomes a test of a larger system. A withdrawal becomes more than a withdrawal. A defeat becomes contagious in the imagination. That is the mental world Korea helped build. By the time the United States fought in the Persian Gulf in 1991, the language was different, but some of the structure remained. Iraq had invaded Kuwait, and the United States led a coalition to expel Iraqi forces. In that sense, the comparison to Korea was closer than in many later conflicts. An aggressor crossed a border, an international coalition responded, and the goal was limited. The Gulf War seemed, to many Americans, to solve the problem that Korea and Vietnam had left behind. It was fast, overwhelming, technologically impressive, and limited. The enemy was driven out of Kuwait. American casualties were low compared with earlier wars. The public saw precision weapons, night skies lit by anti-aircraft fire, briefings with maps and video clips. It felt like war had become controllable again. But even that success fed the habit. It suggested that American military power, properly applied, could correct aggression quickly and restore order. It made force look clean in a way Korea had never looked clean, and Vietnam had made impossible to believe. The addiction did not always come from failure. Sometimes success made the next use of force easier to imagine. After September 11th, 2001, the pattern changed again and became wider, more diffuse, and harder to see. The enemy was no longer a state army crossing a border in uniform. The language became terrorism, homeland security, preemption, insurgency, counterinsurgency, drone strikes, special operations, and endless authorization. Afghanistan began as a response to an attack on the United States and the Taliban's harbouring of al-Qaeda. Iraq in 2003 was justified through weapons claims, dictatorship, regional danger, and the post-9/11 fear that threats had to be stopped before they fully formed. These wars were not Korea, but they existed inside a national security culture Korea helped create. Presidents expected to act globally, Congress often reluctant to fully own the consequences, military force treated as a primary instrument of policy, and the public asked to trust that distant operations were connected to safety at home. The old formal declaration of war remained rare, almost antique, while military action continued under other legal and political forms. Korea had opened that modern doorway. The most striking thing is how normal this became. A country can become accustomed to almost anything if it is repeated slowly enough. Bases abroad become normal. Defence budgets larger than almost any other country can imagine become normal. Troops rotating through distant regions become normal. Drone strikes, discussed in the language of policy, become normal. Presidents announcing operations in countries many citizens cannot locate becomes normal. Veterans returning from wars the rest of the country only half followed becomes normal. The Korean War was one of the first moments when this normality took shape after World War II. It showed that America could fight while much of domestic life continued. It showed that war no longer had to mean total mobilization. It could mean a professional force, a managed public message, a long-term commitment, and a population that cares deeply in moments but cannot sustain attention forever. This has consequences for soldiers. When war is no longer fully shared by the society, those who fight carry a different burden. Korean War veterans came home to a country that often did not know what to do with their experience. They had not returned from the celebrated victory of 1945. They had not yet become part of the national trauma associated with Vietnam. Many simply folded the war into private life. They worked, raised families, joined veterans' organisations, stayed quiet, or spoke only with those who understood. Later generations of veterans from Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan and other operations would know different versions of that distance between military experience and civilian attention. The country sends them, thanks them, argues about the war, forgets parts of it, remembers parts of it, and then moves on unevenly. Korea helped create the modern version of that separation. It also changed the moral language of American power. Before Korea, the United States could tell itself that it fought wars reluctantly and then came home. After Korea, coming home became more complicated. The United States stayed in South Korea because leaving might invite another war. It stayed in Europe through NATO because leaving might invite Soviet pressure. It stayed in Japan because the Pacific balance depended on it. It built a network of commitments that made America both protector and manager, ally and overseer, stabilizer, and participant in other people's political futures. That role brought real benefits to many allies, and it also brought arrogance, overreach, and blindness. A country that sees itself as indispensable can have trouble hearing when others experience its presence differently. South Korea itself complicates any easy judgment. If you look only at the long-term outcome, the American defense of South Korea can appear as one of the stronger arguments for containment. South Korea survived, rebuilt, industrialized, and after decades of struggle became a democracy. Millions of people there live today in a society far freer and more prosperous than the North. That matters. It matters deeply. But if you look only at that, you miss the rubble, the massacres, the authoritarian years, the families divided, the civilians bombed, the villages destroyed, the children orphaned, the veterans damaged, and the precedent set by fighting a war without declaring one. History is not a courtroom where one fact acquits all others. The Korean War can have defended something real and still have taught America dangerous habits. It can have saved South Korea from conquest and still have helped make war a permanent instrument of American policy. Both truths have to stand in the same room. There is also the North Korean memory of the war, which Americans often ignore. In the United States, Korea is forgotten. In North Korea, it is not forgotten at all. The destruction of the war became central to the regime's story of victimhood, resistance, and permanent siege. The bombing, the invasion fear, the division, and the American presence in the South were used to justify militarization and control. This does not excuse the North Korean regime's repression or aggression, but it helps explain why the war's memory remains politically alive there. An unfinished war is useful to governments that need permanent enemies. The tragedy is that the people on both sides of the line inherited leaders, systems, fears, and memories shaped by a conflict none of them could easily escape. For the United States, the unfinished nature of Korea also made it easier to keep thinking in terms of readiness. Every crisis with North Korea in the decades that followed, every border incident, every nuclear development, every exchange of threats, every artillery clash or missile test, reminded Washington that the armistice was not peace. The Korean Peninsula remained one of the places where the Cold War never fully ended. Even after the Soviet Union collapsed, even after communism lost its global ideological momentum, Korea remained divided. That continuity helped preserve the older mindset. The Cold War could end in Europe, but not everywhere. American military power still had lines to guard, allies to reassure, enemies to deter. The mission survived the moment that had supposedly created it. This is how the Korean War stayed in America's blood, as precedent, as posture, as muscle memory. Precedent because presidents learned they could fight without the old formal declaration. Posture because the United States accepted permanent military readiness as normal. Muscle memory because each new crisis seemed to awaken old movements. Show resolve, send forces, protect credibility, consult allies, warn enemies, request funding, manage public concern, define the objective narrowly enough to sound controlled, but broadly enough to justify action. None of this means every use of force after Korea was wrong. History is not that tidy. But it does mean Korea helped create the path along which later decisions travelled. There is a sadness in the phrase forgotten war because it suggests neglect, and neglect is part of it. But perhaps the deeper problem is that Korea was remembered by institutions more than by citizens. The public forgot the war's texture, but the government remembered its uses. The people forgot the cold, the mud, the stalemate, the constitutional ambiguity, the dead who fell after negotiations had already begun. The national security state remembered the precedent, the budgetary logic, the alliance structure, the presidential flexibility, the usefulness of limited war. That imbalance is dangerous. When citizens forget what institutions remember, the lessons of history can become tools rather than warnings. So when you hear that the Korean War ended in 1953, it is worth pausing before accepting the sentence too quickly. The major fighting stopped in 1953, the armistice was signed in 1953, but the war did not leave American life in 1953. It entered the presidency, it entered defense spending, it entered the map of overseas bases, it entered the language of credibility, it entered the habit of undeclared war. It entered the belief that not losing could be victory, that a frozen conflict could be managed indefinitely, that military force could hold the world in place long enough for politics to catch up, even when politics never really did. It entered the American understanding of responsibility so deeply that many later leaders could not tell where responsibility ended and compulsion began. And maybe that is what addiction looks like at the level of a nation. Not joy, not even desire in the ordinary sense, a repeated dependence, a tool reached for because it has been reached for before, a fear of what happens if it is not used, a system of people, money, memory and machinery built around the expectation that the next crisis will require force or the threat of force. Korea did not make America love war. It did something more subtle and more lasting. It made war feel like a permanent condition that could be managed, limited, funded, justified, and survived. It made the country more comfortable living with unfinished conflict. It made the absence of peace feel normal, as long as the shooting stayed far away or controlled. That is why this forgotten war deserves to be remembered clearly, not as a simple mistake. Not as a simple triumph. Not as a footnote between World War II and Vietnam. It was one of the places where the modern American way of war took shape. Undeclared, limited, global, permanent, expensive, morally framed, politically survivable, and difficult to end. The men who signed the armistice stopped a war from continuing in its hottest form, and that mattered. But the habits formed around that war kept moving. They moved into briefing rooms, campaign speeches, budget hearings, air bases, aircraft carriers, research laboratories, and the quiet assumptions of presidents not yet born when the first troops landed in Korea. The line across Korea still asks its question. What does it mean to stop a war without ending it? What does it do to a country to live for decades with armies abroad, enemies named, threats watched, and force always ready? What happens when a republic becomes used to emergencies that never fully pass? The Korean War does not answer those questions neatly. It leaves them in the room with us, and that may be the most honest ending it can offer. Not a clean conclusion, not a final victory, not a lesson simple enough to carve in stone, but a warning that some wars keep working on a country long after the last shot fades, not because the people remember them too much, but because they remember them too little.